Hello everyone and welcome to the second half of the Patreon Drydock for the month of May. There are of course many questions, so we're just going to get straight on with answering them. Monsquire was matched to his only request, Third Friday Ruled, asks, in last month's Patreon episodes you answered a question regarding code-breaking abilities of belligerent navies. As a sort of follow-up, could you explain how these navies went about creating the various levels of code? Did each have specific sections, groups to make certain phrases that weren't reused, improved security, in-house print shops to make code books, specific departments to make sure codes were sent securely to all bases, operating facilities, etc., etc.? Well, to explain all of that would require its own video and quite an extensive one as well. So, for the sake of a Drydock response, I'll try and go over the basics of British encoding and encipherment in the naval field during World War II. Obviously, I've done a whole thing on Enigma, so that explains roughly how Enigma works. Now, British encipherment worked primarily on two levels. The level that was used most of the time in things like Naval Cipher 1, 2, 3, etc. was what was called double encipherment or super encipherment or recipherment, depending on what particular term you want to use. But essentially, this relied on a single master book, and this book would turn individual words into, most typically, although this did vary, depending on the cipher, but most typically would turn it into a 4-digit number. So, for example, battleship might become 7539. So your first step would be to take the message you wanted to transmit, look up all the words in the basic book, and go, okay, now we have a whole series of 4-digit numbers. Now, of course, that's relatively easy to break because words will be repeated quite a lot in communications. People can easily work out which ones mean what. And so this is where you would have the cipher books. So the cipher book would be a whole book that was just full of lines of 4-digit numbers. And the idea was then, theoretically, the operator should randomly select a page and a starting line. And at that point, they would go, okay, well, here's my line of 4-digit numbers. And then you would subtract each number sequence that you came across from your original message. So, and just continue along until you've done the whole message. So let's say, as we said, battleship is 7539. Let's say that it's the second word. So maybe the signal is enemy battleship. So they choose page 17, line 2 to start from. And the second number set there is 1122. So then you subtract 1122 from 7539, which gives you 6417. So that is now the number that means battleship. And you go on through the whole message. You then send off that message, but with the line and page numbers at the beginning. So we said page 17, line 2. So the message would start with 1702 and then a whole string of numbers. And the idea then was that obviously the receiving person would go, okay, page 17, line 2, and then they would go along that. They take the rest of the message and they would add all of those numbers to the message, which would then restore the original numbers. And then they would look up in the basic book and go, well, this number is this number is this, and reconstruct the entire message. Now, in theory, this was fairly secure, because if you were really using randomized selections from a very large book of randomly generated numbers, even if you told people in essentially plain text what your starting point was, like we said, 1702, unless your enemy has access to both the original book of, what the actual numbers for various words mean, and has access to this massive set of tables, then they're, without computer help, which of course they don't have in World War II, they're basically just stuck because they've just got a meaningless bunch of gibberish. They don't know which numbers to add, and they don't know what the final numbers mean anyway. But there were two big problems with this system. First of all was that fairly early in the war, the Germans managed to capture a few copies of the basic book, so the book that said, for example, battleship was 7539, which was half the work done. So at that point, they just had to work out, okay, well, what figures are being subtracted from these numbers to generate these messages. And again, this should have been fairly difficult for them to work out. You can eventually reconstruct these things, but it would take a lot of time. Unfortunately, much as with German Enigma efforts, human error, or more specifically human laziness, came into play. And very often during busy periods, people would just go, okay, well, going back to our previous example, page 17, line 2, I've selected that, I know what those numbers are, I'm just going to keep using page 17, line 2 for the next 20 messages. And of course, that meant that the Germans reading it would go, oh, well, all these messages that have come up will all say 1702 at the beginning. So although we don't know what that set of numbers is, we know that they are probably consistent. And that gives you a massive leg up in deciphering things, because obviously you can look for the same numbers occurring in multiple messages, and then you know that those numbers must correspond all the time to the same word, and then you can start to reconstruct that encipherment line. It also wasn't helped by the fact that an awful lot of messages began in a very similar format, to or from, etc. So those words were quite common. And it meant that the Germans were able to compromise a number of British naval codes. The way that this was eventually solved was, well, several different approaches. Firstly, a different basic code book was issued, which then meant that even if the Germans solved the subtraction section of it, they still didn't know what the basic numbers meant. And they decided to move on from just, well, here's a book with a bunch of codes in it, pick a line and a number, which obviously was very vulnerable to human laziness, and they moved over to a system of, okay, every day you are going to use this page, and then the next page, and obviously it wouldn't be page 2, 3, 4, 5, it would be randomized pages. They also changed the encipherment tables fairly regularly, or they started to. And they also started to use what was called a stencil subtractor frame, which was essentially a grid with random holes cut out on it, and you would overlay that onto the code book, and depending on the position you put it in, obviously it would reveal completely different combinations of numbers, and that then gave you your set of numbers that you would use to subtract. And the reason this was obviously much more secure was where the Germans don't know what the basic numbers are, and the numerical pages that are being used are changing an awful lot more, and you're using the stencil, and also they would encrypt the stencil settings, which they sent out using a separate encryption. So it meant the Germans would first have to work out, okay, what is this random jumble of codes? And if they couldn't crack that, they didn't know the stencil settings. Once they knew the stencil settings, they then had to know what the stencil was, and that's a physical item, not something that's just a series of numbers, so almost impossible to solve. And if they somehow worked that out, then the fact is that instead of being distinct 4-digit groups, as in the previous ciphers, this would just be 4 random numbers from a big block of numbers that on a page, and every time it changed, it would be completely different. So in theory, again, with computers, you might be able to solve that, but for the technology of the time, it was almost impossible to solve. The other thing that they did was they had a system called Typex, which was actually based on the commercially available Enigma. But much like the Kriegsmarine added a rotor compared to the Luftwaffe and the Army, the British added 2 rotors to the basic commercial Enigma system, and they added a whole bunch of additional notches in the gearing that actually rotated the rotors after each key press, which massively complicated the signals compared to the baseline system. And so essentially it was a British version of Enigma, but fiendishly more difficult to solve, and the Germans didn't have a Bletchley Park equivalent. They had very scattered multiple decryption teams, as I mentioned before. The problem with Typex compared to Enigma was that precisely because it was so complex, it was very large and heavy, and also very difficult to produce and very difficult to keep working reliably. And so even though they actually upgraded Typex and made it even harder to decrypt over the course of the war. It was only ever really available in very small quantities, and because of the size and weight, tended to only be really installed in major fixed bases, occasionally very large ships and things like this. But it was quite rare to use it as compared to the number of Enigma machines the Germans were able to produce. So that's just the British, and that's a very short summation thereof. ACC asks, the Chinese treasure fleets are famous, but do they overshadow any other Asian national navies that deserve to be more well known, but are lost to history in the grandeur of their more famous neighbour? To a certain extent, yes. I mean, part of the problem is that the records themselves don't appear in some cases to be particularly well kept, which, to be fair, is sometimes as much a case of the environment as it is of the people themselves, because an awful lot of Southeast Asia that has a coastline is a very tropical area. So whereas in perhaps inland parts of central and northern China, physical documents will survive, same thing with Korea, if you're looking at somewhere like modern-day Thailand, Vietnam, India, all of that area, it's much harder to find places where parchment or paper documents were actually going to last any significant time. So even if they did keep extensive records, a fair number of them won't have survived. And for those that either have survived by luck or because they were put in some form of media that's a bit more resilient, of course, you've then got to try and have them translated, and very often it's a case of translating them from archaic forms of the local languages into modern forms, much the same as if you're trying to translate something about, let's say, Alfred the Great's navy. Theoretically, it's in English, but it's not in a version of English that the modern-day person could just easily read. And then once you've done that, you then have to, if you want it to be more widely known in, say, the Western world, translate that into English. And as a result, while there is some documentation in the form of books and articles and so forth out there, there's not a lot. And obviously that then depends on you coming across it. So I'm sure there are a number of navies and ship types, etc., that were developed by the nations, I should say the nations that occupied the areas that these days we call India, Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, etc., because they're not usually necessarily exactly the same or even close to it in terms of actual geographical area. Sometimes they occupy what today would be multiple countries. Sometimes they only occupy part of one country, one modern country, because the other part is occupied by a rival kingdom. Especially when you look at India, it's forever being taken over, or people attempting to take over the numerous different princely states. So someone who's operating a navy on, say, the western side of India in 1350 will be completely different from the political body that's operating navy on the eastern side of what today we call India in the same year. And if you advance to 1400, then one political group might still be there and operating a similar level of naval force and a similar design of ships, but on the other side, everything might have changed and it'll be a completely different culture with a completely different type of ships operating over there, and so on and so forth. So with that massive caveat in mind, and of course if you do happen to be from one of the Southeast Asian countries or have studied it extensively and you know about a lot more about their historical kind of, if you like, age of sail navies, then let us know in the comments below because we're all interested. But three big examples would obviously be the Korean Navy, or more correctly the Chosun Navy, and they had what for the area were more regular sailing ships, and of course, as you can see here, the turtle ships. They were obviously then also fighting the Japanese, who had come over in their own designs of ships, the Buna and things like this, which were, I hesitate to say floating houseboats, but that's the thing they most remind me of, like multi-story floating houseboats. They're not quite. They are actually ships, not necessarily particularly well suited for massive ocean travel, but they are their own completely distinct design lineage and completely different to Western style ships. If you've ever played Shogun Total War, you'll know what I'm talking about. And that's just two relatively nearby nations in one particular time period. But I did mention the Indian princely states, so it probably should be mentioned that around about the time that various European powers were taking chunks out of it, what would eventually become India, and then of course the British taking pretty much all of it, some of the Indian princely states and the remnants of the Mughal Empire were operating their own sailing warships, most of which would be considered by European standards of the time to be either unrated vessels or sixth-rate frigates, maybe the occasional fifth-rate. They didn't have a ship-of-the-line equivalent, but they did have, a gun deck, occasionally two gun decks, very rarely. But again, the ships were designed in their own style. They didn't just look like mirror-match copies of European vessels with different flags. But again, that's a very, very specific snapshot, mostly, to be fair, on the western Indian coast for a very specific time period. So, yeah, there's loads of stuff to look into. It's just a matter of knowing where to start. Seb Dove asks, what is your personal favourite against all odds story from the Royal Navy, and can you tell us a bit about it? Well, some of you may have already guessed that it's, as a general thing, the Battle of Quiberon Bay. It's basically my favourite Age of Sail naval battle ever. But to avoid rehashing that at length, considering I have a 3-episode mini-series actually all written, all ready to go on that, instead, I'm just going to highlight one particular section of that battle, because, as I say, the whole thing is full of against all odds moments. But at one point, you have Admiral Hawke on his flagship, the Royal George. It's come ploughing through the battle, doing all sorts of improbable things up until that point. And then it comes up against the Soleil Royal, the French flagship, and a dozen other French ships of the line, the leading elements of the French fleet, which have actually managed to get into Quiberon Bay, turned around to receive the British attack. Now, at that point, yes, Royal George is a first-rate ship of the line, but no first-rate ship of the line is going to win a fight against 13 French ships of the line, even if none of them are individually as big as she is. It should be a completely one-sided affair, and it should end with the Royal George sunk or captured, and in the weather that they're fighting in, most likely sunk. However, Hawke, being Hawke, decides discretion is certainly not the better part of valour, madness is the better part of valour, and he just keeps charging head-on at the Soleil Royal, intending to basically take a one-on-one. In many accounts, it's compared to the Joust of Medieval Knights, because he's literally charging headlong at her. And the French see this, and they clearly conclude that nobody in their right mind would possibly engage in a single-ship charge against this many French vessels. Therefore, there must be other English ships coming through behind it. We just can't see them because, well, it's dark and it's rainy and there's sheets of storm water and high waves and spray everywhere, and we can barely see this English ship, so the rest of them must be right behind it. That's why he's so bold in charging. And in that case, 1, the flagship's at risk. 2, we should probably get out of here. And so they actually, one of the French ships of the line takes it upon itself to interpose itself between the Royal George and the French flagship, and it gets badly shot up for its troubles. And then the Superb, comes in and gets sunk for its troubles. It's one of the few cases of a ship of the line being outright sunk, and in fairly short order, in the middle of a battle. And that's as much part of the weather as the fact that, you took a first rate putting double-shotted broadsides into you at point-blank range. So you've got one French ship of the line very heavily damaged, another sunk in a matter of minutes, and the remaining French ships just hightail it from the Royal George, which just keeps chasing them. And the only reason it stops chasing them is that in the looming darkness and the lightning briefly illuminating the seascape, they suddenly realise, both sides realise, that they have been heading for an island in the middle of the bay, which will, smash them all to pieces if they hit it. The French break to port and head further into the bay. The Royal George, at the point that the island is sighted, has been angling a bit more to starboard, trying to bring a broadside to bear, and they realise that they don't have the sea room to come about and continue pursuing the French, and so they break off to starboard, and that ends that particular little section of the battle. But it's at no point during any of that should Hawke's tactics have succeeded. He was completely outnumbered and completely outgunned the entire time, and it's only just through a mixture of luck, massive, massive courage, and a huge amount of bluff that he manages to pull off what he does. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, during the period that the channel covers, how likely is the Copenhagener to become the Copenhagenee? In other words, in the age of sail, it seems like a much safer risk, but for moving forward, if the Germans, for example, had learned of Fischer's visit in 1905, it seems like it would have been pretty easy for a German mine layer to engage in an unannounced mine-laying exercise, and I strongly suspect Pearl Harbor would have gone somewhat differently had fate given the US Navy even 12 hours of notice. So essentially, if someone's going to launch some kind of surprise or semi-surprise operation, how likely is it that the enemy can turn the tables on them? It's not common, but it does happen. Sometimes because the plan is revealed ahead of time, and sometimes because the surprise attack plan just wasn't a particularly good attack plan in the first place. So examples of the latter, as you might guess from this picture, would be the Japanese use of midget submarines. Now, obviously, actually, having mentioned Pearl Harbor, the midget submarine element of the Pearl Harbor attack pretty much entirely failed, unless you go with the theory, which possibly has some currency, that one of them managed to get a torpedo or two into the Oklahoma. But even then, for the amount of effort expended in sending them in, one of them was detected and sunk, and the whole thing just kind of fell apart. The Japanese would also try a separate midget submarine attack against Sydney Harbour, and, well, that also didn't go particularly well. Yes, they managed to hit a ship, but considering, again, the amount of time and effort and the number of mini-subs involved, it was basically that tables turned. The Japanese lost more than they gained. But in an example of theoretically a good plan, but scuttled by poor intelligence and on your part and good intelligence on the enemy's part, probably the single biggest example would actually be the Battle of Midway, because remember, the Japanese think that at the very minimum that Yorktown has been knocked out of action, or they know that Lexington's been sunk. At most, they think actually both Yorktown and Lexington were sunk at Coral Sea. So as far as they are aware, the Americans only have Yorktown and Enterprise left. So they take 4 carriers out, and the whole plan is we'll attack Midway, and this will lure the American carriers out, and when they are lured out, we will find them, and then we will destroy them with our vastly superior carrier air fleet. Of course, thanks in part to poor Japanese intelligence, and thanks in part to heroic efforts by Pearl Harbor's dockyard crew, the Americans actually go out with 3 carriers, but even then, with the Japanese being the fleet that's in position, theoretically having all their recon stuff out, and honestly having the better carrier aircraft launch doctrine at that point, as I've covered at various stages, even though they were actually technically outnumbered thanks to the Americans having carriers crammed full of aircraft, theoretically the Japanese should have won that engagement. They should have successfully lured the Americans in and then hit them and destroyed them. However, of course, not only did the Americans have a carrier that the Japanese weren't expecting, but thanks to American intelligence and code-breaking efforts, they knew that the Japanese were coming. They knew roughly where they were going to be, and thus they were able to position their carriers in such a way that, well, you get the historic Battle of Midway. There's obviously a huge element of luck involved as well, but what at the end of the day had started out as a Japanese plan to lure in and destroy the last elements of the American carrier force ended up with the Japanese losing the vast majority of their carrier force instead, in exchange for a carrier which, according to the Japanese at least, had possibly already been sunk. Monib Tesham, I think, asks, realistically speaking, if the Japanese centre force had not withdrawn at Samar, how significant of an effect would this have had on the Leyte landings, and how much would this have delayed, if any, the end of the war? I don't think it's going to delay the end of the war all that much, if at all, because functionally speaking, to end the war in the Pacific, the only conditions you have to fulfill are, do the US occupy the airfields necessary to launch the B-29s with the atomic bombs in summer 1945? And yeah, they will, regardless of what happens at Leyte. However, if the centre force had kept going and hit the landings at Leyte, they could have done quite a lot of significant damage locally and delayed the reoccupation of the Philippines by a reasonable amount. Now, sometimes you'll see people who go, oh no, but all the landings were done on the 20th. That's 5 days ago. So all the ships were empty. The supply ships were empty, and they could have just run away. And I'll sit there and go, you people clearly have no idea how an amphibious landing actually works. Because, for one thing, amphibious landing ships and supply ships can't run away from battle cruisers and fast battleships and destroyers and heavy cruisers. They are fundamentally far too slow to do that. But secondly, just because the landings had occurred, or the main landings, the initial landings had occurred 5 days earlier, in no way, shape or form means that everything is done and dusted. For one thing, you have to keep supplying the people who are on the front lines. You know, yeah, you pile out of an LST or an LCT or whatever, and you've got a few dozen rounds of ammunition for your rifle. The tank's got some fuel and some shells and so forth. After 5 days of fighting, you don't have that ammunition or the food that you brought with you, etc., etc. You're being resupplied by stuff that is being put ashore on the beachheads. And that is an ongoing process. Additionally, just because a whole bunch of troops landed on the 20th doesn't mean all the troops landed on the 20th. There are still elements of formations that landed on the 20th in terms of regiments and divisions, and parts of those units are still being landed on the 24th, the 25th, the 26th, the 27th, and there are whole additional units whose only start landing at Leyte on the 23rd, 24th, 25th, and onwards. So there are still loads of ships packed full of troops, loads of ships packed full of supplies, all trying to get stuff ashore. Now, in the absolute best case scenario for the US Navy, everybody hears that Taffy 3's been smashed and the centre force is advancing and everybody should run. Now, that will minimise losses to a certain degree because, hey, you can just run away, and much like with convoys, which again individually can't outrun a raiding German surface vessel, but if they split and run in all directions, you can only kill so many of them. It would, minimize the amount that the Japanese could catch and kill. Of course, Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet would come up and have some disagreements with the Japanese over what they were doing, and eventually Halsey would show up and finish them off. So there would be a time-limited amount of damage that the Japanese could do. But even if the losses amongst the landing forces aren't too great, and you still could be looking at thousands upon thousands of losses if the Japanese managed to catch and sink even one of the heavily laden troop vessels, or APDs, but you're still looking at, at least 24 hours, possibly more, of disruption to the supply effort, and there's vicious ongoing fighting ashore. If those men are now going to be potentially burning through the supplies they have on land, they're either going to have to curtail any offensive operations or possibly even have to fall back because you may have localized units running out of food and ammunition because there's not a continuous supply from the beaches. Because it's not just that more supplies aren't landing on the beaches, it's also a fact that if you've got a pell-mell naval battle happening right off the beaches, the chances of people at those beachhead supply depots just happily continuing to move what supplies are already there forward is relatively minimal when they're probably being shot at by at least one or more large Japanese vessels. They're going to be, diving for cover. And of course, that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is there's some communications foul up that means that they don't really know that the Japanese are coming until the last minute, at which point the Japanese just start sinking supply ships and troop ships and landing ships left, right, and centre, at which point you're looking at 5-figure casualty numbers amongst, again, the units that haven't landed yet. Multiple supply ships sunk, so those supplies are out of action. Of course, everyone also still runs. 7th Fleet with Admiral Kinkaid is forced to fight a very difficult close-range action with the landing forces running left, right, and centre all through it. Again, eventually Centre Force will be ground down and defeated by a mixture of Admiral Kinkaid's forces and Halsey's, but it's going to take a while, and it could, I mean, it's not necessarily going to completely compromise the landings, because, as I said, worst case scenario, the US units that are ashore can fall back and just dig in using what supplies they've got available, but it would hugely disrupt the landing efforts. And I mean, if the Japanese were coordinating properly, potentially they could throw the landing efforts back in the sea, but when were the Japanese Army and Navy ever going to cooperate properly? So you don't necessarily have to worry about that quite so much, but then it would take quite a while to re-establish things. So you'd have to work out which supply ships have survived and what supplies have survived. Okay, we need to get them ashore and, you know, get the shore action going again. Which units are still around in terms of the troops? Where are they? Can we get them over here? Search and rescue efforts for the thousands of men who are in the water. Working out which bits of 7th Fleet have survived, because in that kind of close-range action, there are going to be casualties involved there. You'd be talking about weeks of disruption, because apart from, you know, getting what's left of your men and supplies ashore, you've now got to get replacements for all the stuff that's been sunk or damaged brought in. And yeah, so it could completely have stuffed up the Philippines campaign. But I think ultimately, even in a worst case scenario, you're still looking at significant delays to the Philippines campaign, but it's not going to stop the necessary airfields having been taken by summer by the time the atomic bomb is ready, at which point, well, the atom bomb goes in, and even if the US hasn't held Iwo Jima and Okinawa and all the other places that they'd go on to seize for as long, and therefore maybe the firebombing campaign across Japan hasn't been done quite as extensively, they're still there. And, well, atom bombs only need to be dropped once or twice. John Plate asks, is a midships turret just a way for navies to be like, hey, look, we have more guns? It seems like they were a bit of a pain being in between the engines and the boilers, and having to put energy into keeping the magazines cool is obviously not fun. And then you've got the fact there's more magazines in the Citadel, the fire arcs on the turrets aren't the best, sometimes you could even damage your own ship. Wouldn't it be better just to have a bigger power plant? And what were the difficulties in getting a 3-gun design? It just seems so logical. How fast could they have gone if they'd got rid of the midships turret and just added more engine power to something like Iron Duke? Well, when you're looking at the sort of World War I and immediate pre-World War I ship designs, you've got to remember that they are still very, very much thinking in terms of broadside battleship engagements. And in that respect, a well-designed midships turret or two actually has reasonable fire arcs for what you're trying to do. Yeah, you don't have a forward or rear fire arc to any great degree, but if you're supposed to be broadside onto the enemy, then, well, that doesn't really matter so much. Of course, it is possible to completely stuff up your firing arcs if you don't design the ship properly, but it's not necessarily a massive issue. But you've also got to remember that when they're designing ships and they're upgrading from, say, 12-inch guns to 13.5 or 14-inch guns, which is obviously when you very commonly see midships turrets, although you do see them with some 12-inch designs as well, you're looking at an era when they are looking at weight of fire, i.e. total weight of the broadside in terms of pounds of shells, as much as they're looking at anything else. And there's also the fact that, obviously, if you're going from, say, a 12-inch ship to a bigger vessel, dropping from 12 guns to 8 guns, well, you've taken, even regardless of the capabilities of the shells, you've just removed 1/3 of your total chances to hit, whereas going from 12 guns to 10 guns, well, if each shell can hit considerably harder, and then maybe losing 2 guns can be justified. So, for example, roughly speaking, the broadside of an American or a British 12-gun, 12-inch design is a little bit over 10,000 pounds of shells. If you're the US, for example, and you're going up to 14-inch guns with 1,400-pound shells, then going with an 8-gun design, you've only barely added maybe half a shell weight, if that, to your broadside weight. So what's the point of going through all the expense if your broadside weight hasn't increased so much? And I say this is more of what they're thinking about at the time, less so about specific armor penetration properties. Whereas with a 10-gun design, you're actually increasing your broadside weight by about 40%, so this is a good thing. And with the British, with the lighter 13.5-inch shell that you find being used on the Orions at the start of things, then actually going down to an 8-gun design means that you actually have a slightly lighter broadside weight than a 12-gun, 12-inch ship. If you're using the heavier design shells that you find in the later 13.5-inch ships, then it's basically the same equation as with the American 14-inch guns, because they also happen to weigh 1,400 pounds. But essentially that's the thing. If you're going to go through all the additional expense of having a whole brand new gun on board with, bigger turrets, etc., they want to see a heavier broadside weight. And having 10 guns is a way to do that, whereas having 8 guns, you just don't. Now, of course, it would be better to go with a triple turret or 3-gun design, because then you can either have 3 triple turrets and 9 guns, which gives you a slightly increased broadside weight and massively reduced citadel volume, or a Nevada-style twin over triples, or later American standard 4 triples. And this is a better way of doing things than having an amidships turret. But as I've mentioned in the past, while there were working triple turret designs even in the 12-inch era, as you see with things like the Tegethoffs and then later some of the Italian dreadnoughts, there was a certain degree of technical complexity to them, an increased need for maintenance, an increased potential for failure, and of course the fact that you're concentrating more guns in fewer turrets, which means if you lose turrets, you lose a proportionally larger portion of your armament, that made a number of navies fairly risk-averse when it came to employing them. There's also the fact that although you do save space overall, the individual footprint of each triple turret is slightly larger, which means you do tend to need a slightly larger ship in terms of beam, and therefore if you want it to have the same speed, a slightly longer length to accommodate them. And some navies are, well, all navies are under the eagle eyes of the various treasuries, but some navies consider more than others, like, say, the US Navy. And just look at the fight they had to try and get triple turrets onto the Nevadas. Now, in terms of power, well, obviously this gets a little bit complicated because you've got to work out how much space you've got and also what's the overall weight saving going to be. If you take out the turret, the barbette, etc., the magazines, but then you stick in a bunch of extra boilers, have you saved weight, have you gained weight, etc.? So just assuming that the weight is neutral for the moment, if you look at the plans for the Iron Duke class, they have 3 rows of 6 boilers in the format that they're in normally. The space that the magazine for the amidships turret takes up is between the aft boiler set and the turbines. To me, it doesn't quite look like you could fit another full row of boilers in there. Just a little bit tight, but it's possible with a little bit of rearrangement of the whole machinery space, you might just manage it. So let's be really generous and assume that you manage to get another whole row of 6 boilers in. And again, being generous, we'll say, okay, well, you get 29,000 shaft horsepower from 18 boilers. So if we stick up to 24 boilers, that's going to push us to just over 36,000 shaft horsepower. And then using the standard power curve formula, that would suggest that you'd increase speed by about 2 knots. So from around about 21.25 to 21.5 knots to around 23.5 knots. Just based purely on a theoretical increase in power, nothing else changing. Now, of course, if the ship becomes somewhat lighter because you've removed the gun turrets and the weight of the boiler isn't as great, then you might push that up a little bit further, maybe to 24 knots. But also, if you're going to put that much power in, you're also going to change the profile of the ship a little bit. So I would say if you were aiming more for that kind of thing, and you just said, okay, we're just going to stick some another row of boilers in, but we're going to lengthen the ship slightly so we definitely can get another row of 6 boilers in there, maybe refine the bow and stern lines a little bit as well, then you could probably push up to 24 knots reasonably comfortably. And before everyone starts jumping up and down and saying, oh, yes, but to reach just over 24 knots, the Queen Elizabeth's class needed 75,000 shaft horsepower, not essentially half that. I would point out that, well, yes, but also the Queen Elizabeth class weighed like 8,000 tons more than the Iron Dukes, so they need a lot more power to push that mass through the water. Although, interestingly enough, they actually do have 24 water tube boilers, so you could also switch up the boilers, which, shaft horsepower per boiler, and that might just push your speed up as well. David B asks, question for you. What was CVA 01's flight deck recovery area, brackets, runway full length, its overall flight deck beam at its widest point, and if it had not had CDART planned aft and gone for a full flight deck at the stern, then what would the through flight deck runway length have been then? I've been fascinated with CVA 01, and it's a pity that she and her sisters were never built. So, bearing in mind that obviously CVA 01 is from a period that the channel doesn't normally cover, I did do a bit of poking around at various plans and projects surrounding CVA 01, looked up a few good references, and the best answers I can find for you is that the flight deck length as planned was supposed to be 930 feet on a total hull length of 963 feet, because as you said, at the back there's the CDART launchers, with the maximum width being either 230 feet, that's quoted as the flight deck maximum width, but the total beam is quoted in other documents as 231 foot 4 inches, and considering that the flight deck is the widest portion of the ship, well, I mean, it's within a foot and a bit, but yeah, around about 230 feet, which I suspect that widest point is going to be just aft of the island, as you can see on this picture here. Now, in terms of what if CDART wasn't included, well, going, again, roughly by the framing numbers and then converting the total number of frames on the ship to individual feet and then multiplying out, assuming that the flight deck just extended to the stern, you'd be looking at roughly another 50 feet. So the flight deck would then be 980 feet long. And of course, there is the option for a little bit of a stern overhang, which might push you up to 60, 70 feet or so of additional flight deck space. So hopefully that is helpful. Nietvitz of Gdansk asks, in one of the previous dry docks, you answered questions about razee ships. My personal definition is that a razee ship is something that has been downgraded but remains fully functional in the fleet on the front lines. So, in my opinion, razee ships of the 20th century could include, for example, the Effingham-class cruisers, the C-class cruisers converted to AA ships, the Delhi, the Bliskovica, all of which were refitted with smaller guns and used primarily for anti-aircraft work, Bouja, which went from being a destroyer to a destroyer escort in 1942, the flush deck destroyers that were converted into escort ships or mine layers, or alternatively the Norwegian coast defence ships captured by the Germans and then turned into anti-aircraft ships or mine layers. I would exclude ships like Iron Duke and Langley as they no longer served in frontline roles after being rebuilt, but extreme examples could be the Lexington, Akagi and Kaga as their full-scale capital ships razeed down to support ships. At least that's how aircraft carriers were perceived in the 20s. What do you think of this definition of razee ships? Honestly, I'm kind of on the fence with that one. I mean, I can see the point in that from a somewhat more abstract perspective, the razees of the Age of Sail are taking a frontline ship, downgrading its capability and role, but it remains a frontline ship, so ship of the line becoming a heavy frigate, for example. And from that perspective, most of the categories that you mentioned work. Obviously, you can see here Delhi with her 5-inch 38 guns as an anti-aircraft cruiser. The reason I'm on the fence, though, is because the Age of Sail razees are specifically characterized by cutting away significant amounts of their superstructure, making them physically smaller ships, but retaining not all, but the heaviest of their armament. So in the case of, two-deckers, they lose the upper deck of guns, but those upper deck guns are usually 12 or 18 pounders, and they retain the heavy lower deck armament, 24 or 32 pounders, and that's what makes them so effective. Whereas in a lot of the cases you cite, it's the superstructure is actually staying, or in some cases even being improved or expanded, and it's the weaponry that's being considerably reduced, the main guns that are being reduced and made lighter. Now, the funny thing is that then your extreme examples of the carriers actually would fit a little bit closer to the original razee specification, because although they do have obviously hangars and flight decks built onto them, compared to the big superstructures and gun turrets they were going to have as battleships or battle cruisers, the Lexingtons, Akagi, Kaga, etc., and you just look at the displacement as well, they are losing weight and upper deck works. That's all being stripped away, very much like the 64 and 74 gun razees. And then they are, lighter ships, not necessarily small, because the hull dimension, length and beam-wise, are similar. And then in the carrier's case, they're not retaining their original guns or some of their original guns, but they're swapping it out for a different kind of weapon. So, yeah, in overall abstract, I could support the idea, although, as I said, the reason I'm just on the fence is because from a very specific how you turn a ship of the line into a razee frigate, the 20th century way of doing it is almost the opposite way around. But, you can take your pick either way. I wouldn't object to it being used. I just might raise an eyebrow. Bill Brockman asks, was the beautiful ship spell, technically submarine spell or boat spell, but anyway, that your king presented to our president something that every Royal Navy warship possessed, even during a world war? So this refers to the, at least at time of recording, relatively recent state visit by King Charles III, and he presented the current US president, again, current obviously at the time of recording, if you're listening to this 5-10 years down the line, that's obviously not the case, with a bell from the submarine Trump. Shockingly enough, you guess why they presented that bell, because of course it has the name Trump inscribed on it. So yes, the answer is even in a world war, every commissioned Royal Navy warship was expected to have a bell. Obviously, for most of them it would be a ship's bell. A submarine is not a ship, but even a submarine, as was evidenced by that, would have a bell. The main difference, though, would be that on a surface warship, generally that bell would just be in place most of the time. Whereas on a submarine, because the bell is normally hung outside the sub, during wartime, the bell would be taken into the sub and stored somewhere inside. Obviously, it could then be rehoisted if they're in port or whatever, and they want to use it. But you obviously don't want to leave the bell out and about in the sea while the submarine is underwater, or if it's sneaking around on the surface at night where potentially its ringing could give the submarine's position away. So, and everything down to even a sub would have a bell. Once you get further down to things like MTBs and MGBs and stuff, it's perhaps somewhat less clear. So destroyers, sloops, corvettes, submarines, yes, they would have a ship's bell. MTBs, MGBs, that kind of thing, they might have a bell, but I don't think you're going to find mass production, HMS MGB 391, 392, 393, 394, etc. bells. I could be wrong, but I'm 99% sure that wasn't a thing for vessels of that kind of size, although you might have had the occasional boat that did go for it and maybe privately commissioned it or everything. And of course, those ships would still have bells. They just be relatively small ones, so they wouldn't necessarily qualify as a ship, or in that case, a boat's bell. The Hand of Ray asks, how would heavy cruisers have evolved without the Washington Naval Treaty? Weirdly enough, I think you might actually have seen a re-emergence of the old protected cruiser, armoured cruiser divide, or, if you like, the later emergence, thanks to the London Naval Treaties, of the heavy cruiser, light cruiser divide. because you had ships of around about 10,000 tons with 8-inch or close to enough makes no difference, guns being built in the late 1910s and early 1920s anyway, which is in large part why they happened to set the displacement and armament limits for cruisers at the Washington Naval Treaty at 10,000 tons and 8-inch guns. But during the 1920s, when that was essentially the only limitation on cruisers per ship, you tended to see everyone or nearly everyone just went straight up to that limit or close to it. You know, everyone's like, well, if that's the limit, obviously everyone else is going to build to that limit, so we have to as well. So you get 9 to 10,000 ton ships all armed with 8-inch guns. It's only really as you get into the 30s and you start to see the London Naval Treaty and various other pressures that you start to see smaller and or less heavily armed vessels coming back into play. But without that pressure, I think you would have seen a development of 2 entirely separate types of cruiser. So you would have seen the trade protection -- fleet scout type cruiser, and obviously depending on which navy, it will depend on what they're calling it. But essentially that would be broadly analogous to the light cruiser of the 1930s, but I think on a smaller scale. You'd probably see designs in the 6 to 8,000 ton range with 5-inch, 5.5-inch, 6-inch guns, basically whatever can be fitted on that's quick firing and you can get a fair number of, with much more of an emphasis on speed and just enough armor to resist destroyer gunfire and maybe medium to long distance fire from their peers and maybe battleship secondaries. And that's actually, ironically enough, even with the treaty system in place, what a number of nations would actually build. So some of the later Italian condottieries, the French light cruisers, and the Leanders to a certain extent, and possibly some of the design options that were looked into before they settled on the Town class. So they were looking at, for example, a 3 triple turret 6-inch cruiser to succeed the Leanders at about 8,000 tons. But I think that would be one set of cruisers, and those would be the cheaper, mass-produced ones that you'd see in large numbers. And then the 8-inch, 10,000-ton-ish cruisers like the Furutakas, Albas, etc., that were already under consideration or under construction at the beginning of the 1920s, those would have done their own thing and probably expanded both in size and armament because they'd be in competition with each other. And I think those probably would have settled in at somewhere between 15 to 20,000 tons, give or take a little bit, because much beyond that, and they're getting so big and expensive, you might as well build a capital ship. Much below that, and you wouldn't be able to fit the necessary heavy armament and armor and speed to compete with other similar vessels. And so those ships, some would have lots of 8-inch guns, some might have 9.2-inch guns, a few people might play around with 10-inch guns, but it'd be the 8 to 10-inch caliber range. And much like armoured cruisers, they'd be very well protected against smaller cruiser gunfire, somewhat protected against pier gunfire, and they would be kind of force flagships, overseas distant station flagships, carrier protection vessels, ancillary units to the battle line in some cases, very much like the old armoured cruiser role. And you might think, well, didn't the battle cruiser make the armoured cruiser obsolete? Well, yes, but by the 1920s, the battle cruiser had kind of blown past its original role and was now essentially a faster, slightly less heavily armed capital ship in comparison to the period battleship. And when you look at things like the G3s and some of the stuff that the Japanese were proposing to build in the late 20s, you can kind of see that the fast battleship was beginning to emerge in naval thinking in the early 1920s. So you might have had some nations which still stuck with the big heavy battleship and slightly faster battle cruiser role, but essentially those would have blown through to like 16-inch, 18-inch, or possibly larger guns with exceptionally heavy armor, and they're still mostly going to be, mid to high 20s of knots of speed, whereas these new cruisers, the reinvention of the armored cruiser essentially, they're going to be over 30 knots and as you say, the gulf in armament is going to be quite considerable, because you're essentially hitting an upper barrier of rate of fire once you move into 12-inch guns. Unless something really dramatic changes naval technology-wise, your rate of fire is going to drop off quite dramatically, and again, the expense issue would come into play as well. Although I'm sure at some point, maybe in the late 20s or early 30s, some genius would just go, oh, well, if we were to put 10 or 14-inch guns on a 25,000-ton, 30,000-ton hull, because at this point capital ships are going to be 50, 60,000 tons, then we would have a ship that's fast enough to catch and kill these big armoured cruisers, and then we can only build a few of them, and we can mop them all up, and then they might be more useful in the battle line, and essentially the battle cruiser concept gets reinvented again. George Robert asks, can you tell us the history of paying off pennants and maybe a story about them? So, paying off pennants, or coming home pennants, as they're sometimes known in some navies, have a long history, but it varies quite considerably, but depending on both time period and navy. So for the sake of, again, fitting into just a Drydock answer, I'm going to go with the Royal Navy's version of things. And some of you who've served in various other navies may recognise some or all of the elements thereof. So when a ship is commissioned, it flies a commissioning pennant, which is a very long, thin pennant that's usually some modification on the national flag. But when a ship is being decommissioned or paying off in age of sail times, it would also fly a paying off pennant. And the idea of this was basically to signal the ship's active service is done, or in the age of sail, that crew's active service is done, because obviously they have signed up for a specific amount of time. The original tradition was that you started off with a relatively small pennant, and then you just took rags and various other bits and pieces and tied them all together into one long, thin sort of flag, essentially saying, hey, look, we don't need all these things anymore, and was assigned to everyone, hey, this ship is going out of service. Obviously, in the age of sail, that happened very regularly during a ship's career. It'd go out for a few years, come back, pay off, go into reserve or refit, recommission with a new crew, and on it would go. But as time went on, and that particular practice of commissioning and decommissioning, commissioning and decommissioning the ship became much rarer, then it moved over to being flown essentially rather as a paying off pennant, more of as just a decommissioning pennant. So when you were on your final voyage, you would fly this thing. For example, in the Admiralty Manual of Seamanship, it says, since before the Napoleonic Wars, it was the custom of HM ships to fly a paying off pennant at the main truck when they left their fleet to return to their home port to pay off. Custom ordained that the length of the pennant should equal the length of the ship if she left station at the end of a normal period of foreign service. If, however, a commission had been extended, the length of the pennant was increased in proportion to the extra length of service. For example, a commission of 2 years extended to 2 years and 2 months would mean the length of the pennant would be the length of the ship plus 1/12. It was similar to and flown in place of the masthead pennant, and was displayed by a ship from a foreign station when entering or leaving harbours during her passage home, and by a ship of the fleet on leaving for and arriving at her home port. It was also the custom on all stations for a ship to fly this pennant on the Sunday preceding her departure, or, if already in her paying off port, on the Sunday preceding the day on which she paid off. Now, you can probably see a little bit of a problem here in that, sure, in a ship that's 100, 200 foot long, scraping together a pennant that's 100 or 200 feet long out of rags and so forth, probably not a problem. But when you get to the period of a battle cruiser, for example, that might be 700, 800, 900 feet long, coming in to decommission at the end of its career, one, where on earth are you going to find a pennant that's 800 feet long? And secondly, how do you keep such a thing aloft? How do you keep it from tearing itself apart? And if you've been delayed in your paying off, and you might need, a 900,000, 1,100 foot pennant, the problems just escalate. So different navies, including the Royal Navy, at various points during the 20th and 21st centuries have tried to come up with different solutions to this. One was just go, half the ship's length, which still doesn't help if you need 500 foot of pennant. Another option was to do 10 foot for every year the ship had been in service. So even if the ship had been in service for 30 years, okay, you needed 300 feet of pennant. That's actually about doable. And there are photos of ships flying 400 foot paying off pennants around in the late 20th century. Another option, if you wanted to be really economical, was 1 foot for every year the ship had been in service. And for most ships that have been in service for quite a while, 20, 30, 40 feet of pennant is still quite impressive. And there are various combinations and permutations thereof, like a fixed length plus a foot for every year it's been in service, and all sorts of things like this. And as I say, that last bit isn't the Royal Navy. That's just a whole slew of different navies trying different things, including the Royal Navy, with various experiments. But in terms of a quick story, one of the things that is actually known to have happened in the latter part of the 20th century is that some paying off pennants, based both on the size of the ship and the length of it being in service, are so ridiculously long that they would trail in the water for most of their length, and it would obviously just not be a particularly good show. And so there are a fair number of reported instances of either in shorter versions where officers have rigged together some kind of flotation device, usually a football or something like that, or a balloon, just to keep the tip out the water. And in other cases, people have got really inventive, and a few pennants have been flown at exceptional length with lots of helium balloons tied to them along the length to keep them up in the air, which no doubt makes it look very festive as well. Marlin Stout asks, you mentioned SMS Prince Regent Luitpold's dual propulsion system with a centre shaft powered by diesels and the outer shaft powered by steam turbines, and how they would need different fuels. My question is, would it be practical or even possible to build a diesel that can run on the same bunker oil used for the steam plant, or vice versa, to make the boilers run on diesel fuel instead of oil? And what would be the drawbacks of either system if that would be possible, and which, if any, would be more practical? Is it possible to do a single fuel system? Yes. Practical depends. Are you made of money? So essentially, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, the fundamental problem is that bunker oil is horrible stuff. It's not crude oil. It's what's left after you've taken all the nicer stuff out of crude oil. Some grades of bunker fuel, you have to preheat just to get it viscous enough to actually go into the fuel sprayers. The worst grades of bunker fuel on a cold day, you could literally just, scoop out with a spoon, put it on deck and cut it into slices with a knife and watch it gradually ooze everywhere. So, yeah, that is not going in a diesel plant. A diesel plant it needs aerosolization of the fuel for it to work, and bunker fuel, the typical bunker fuel used on ships, it's too thick, too nasty to be really practically of any use in a diesel engine. However, the flip side, running a steam boiler on diesel instead of bunker fuel, that is entirely possible. And in fact, it is actually done these days. So if you, and I don't mean as in there are diesel ships, I mean literally there are ships which used bunker fuel in the first half of the 20th century, and now they run on diesel. The various Liberty ships and Victory ship that are preserved, for example, if you go to the steam school over in Boston, they actually physically run the engines on diesel now because, well, dealing with bunker C is horrible, horrible work, and B, actually diesel fuel is much easier to get hold of than bunker C these days, certainly if you're a civilian. And so, yeah, you can absolutely run a bunker C fueled steamship or steam boiler on diesel fuel, and therefore, in theory, you could run the entire ship on diesel with a single fuel system. The big downside, especially, as I say, in the early 20th century, is that diesel fuel is considerably more expensive than bunker C. The reason why diesel could sometimes be seen to work was that if you paired it with diesel engines, you got a ridiculous extension in range. So the price per litre was, or price per gallon, or price per barrel even in ship terms, was much, much higher. But the amount of extra travel you got out of it meant that your price per mile was at least competitive, if not possibly less, because you didn't need to refuel as often. Obviously, depending on the exact diesel grade you're using and where you are in the world, because if you're in a country that has to import diesel, that's obviously going to cost a lot more than if you're in a country that can make its own. The problem is if you then go and use the diesel in a steam-powered boiler, you're not getting the extra efficiency or much extra efficiency out of using diesel as compared to using it in an actual diesel engine. And therefore, in an era where diesel fuel is very expensive, the cost of actually running the entire ship is going to go up to a point far beyond any notional savings you might make for not having a dual fuel system. Able34 Bravo asks, this may be a difficult question given the absurd number of variables involved, but in terms of deployed air group, which aircraft carrier of any in the period covered by the channel has had the most powerful air group ever relative to what was possible in the time that said carrier operated? For example, given the state of naval aircraft in the 1920s, an F-7 Seahawk may be vastly more powerful against other contemporary aircraft compared to an F-14 against MiG-29s, and thus Lexington CV-2 might, in 1928, have an edge over Enterprise CVN-65 in 1985 or Theodore Roosevelt CVN-71 in 2022. Well, if you want to be really cheesy with the answer, you could point to something like HMS Furious when she's in this configuration with her fore and aft flight decks, simply because at that point she would have had a mixture of fighters, which are essentially, here's a current land-based fighter only at sea, and therefore is equally as capable, near enough, and later on in this format would be testing things like the Cuckoo, which would be the first production naval torpedo bomber, and therefore has the most powerful strike aircraft because it has the only strike aircraft that's in existence at that point. But I think that's being a little bit cheeky with the question. So going more with the spirit of the question, I think your answer is probably going to be either the Lexingtons at the very end of the 1920s, because they have a combination of the greatest usable anti-surface firepower with their 8-inch guns, combined with the largest air group that any nation's carrier is going to have. And yeah, there are technological differences between British, American, and Japanese carrier aircraft in 28, 29, but the sheer number of aircraft that the Lexingtons can put up compared to anybody else kind of, tips the balance in their favour in terms of most powerful. There would be an interesting conversation to be had around immediate post-World War II carrier air groups, because obviously you've got the US with the Midways, which would then obviously have by default the largest air groups, and the only competition is the British. The British don't have as large air groups, but if you want to talk about on a per pound basis, a per aircraft basis, then you get into all sorts of interesting arguments about things like the Bearcat and the Sea Fury and the Wyvern, and because you're seeing a sort of a trend back towards multi-purpose aircraft, obviously with things like the Sky Raider as well, and the Night Fighter, Sea Hornet, and Sea Mosquito, and so forth. It would be a very interesting conversation to try and work out how do you determine the relative power of each of those aircraft relative to each other, and then obviously from a generic carrier air group perspective. But when you're looking at, say, the mid to late 30s and then going into the Second World War, it becomes very difficult to point to a most powerful air group outside of just sheer size of air group, simply because naval aircraft are being introduced and superseded so fast that you could point to a given year and go, right, well, in this year, the let's say, the Royal Navy has a clear advantage in its naval fighter. This newly introduced fighter is clearly superior to the 2, 3, 4-year-old fighters in the Japanese and American navies. However, at the same time, the dive and torpedo bomber designs in the Royal Navy might be 4 or 5 years old, and one or the other of the two competing carrier navies might have a significantly newer strike aircraft or two in service. And then the question is obviously, well, does the new superior fighter counter and shoot down the new and somewhat superior strike aircraft, or does the new and superior strike aircraft's ability to hit, assuming that it gets through with considerably more force, does that mean that that makes that carrier group the most powerful? And then you go forward the next year and everything's changed again as new aircraft get introduced. And then, of course, obviously, you've got the whole balance of sheer size of air group versus doctrine, because it's all very well having really powerful aircraft if you only get a third of them off in a reasonable time, and versus efficiency. So again, if you've got, let's say, aircraft, if you say an aircraft is 10 out of 10, so it's the absolute top of its tree for that year, well, if taking fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, if you have one air group that's made out of a 10 out of 10, an 8 out of 10, and a 9 out of 10 aircraft in each category, and you've got another navy that's got, say, a 6, and a 7, then the first air group would obviously theoretically be far more powerful on a per plane basis because they're far more capable aircraft. But if that first air group is only, say, 50 and the other air group is 90 strong, then how do you rate the power then? Are you rating it on a per flight, per squadron basis, or on an entire air group basis, in which case obviously quantity makes up a quality of all of its own? The Weeaboo Terminator asks, given that the simulated air raids on Pearl Harbor during Fleet Problems 13, 14 and 19 seem to predict the events of the Day of Infamy, how much did it change the opinions of the officer corps with respect to the validity of the fleet problems? I'm going to interpret that as meaning, did people change their minds as to what the fleet problems predicted once they saw Pearl Harbor happening? Went, oh yeah, we kind of saw that one coming, I guess. Well, as far as I can see, I mean, obviously some people did point to the fleet problems and go, hey, we should have seen that one because, well, we kind of did it ourselves. But one of the bigger problems was that, obviously, you've watched my fleet problem videos, a good chunk of the fleet problems were full-on battle line exercises. Now, there were ancillary things like attacking Pearl Harbor and so forth that were done, but a big chunk of the fleet problems were straight-up fleet battle line engagements. And the one thing was that Pearl Harbor meant the US Navy didn't have a fleet battle line for a good chunk of the early portion of the war. So even if people had gone, oh yeah, maybe there's more to these fleet problems than we thought, they simply didn't have the ships to exercise those options anymore. Although, with that having been said, there were the ancillary things like simulated landings, simulated independent carrier operations, which very much more closely resembled what the US Navy was actually going to end up doing in the Pacific War, and indeed what its plans had been changed to in the last few years in the run-up to the Pacific War. And from what I've been able to see from discussions around planning early operations, a good chunk of, I'd say, the very early Pacific campaign operations that the US Navy undertakes is literally people taking various exercises or sub-exercises from the fleet problems and going, this, but with these ships and over here. So things like the early carrier raids in the first few months of 1942, almost carbon copy to a certain extent from operations that had been tried in the fleet problems. And even certain exercises like, running in close to Japanese ships to get broadsides away rather than risk long distance night engagements. Again, something that had been looked at to a certain degree in the fleet problems. Of course, the other issue was that by the time the US Navy starts to regenerate its power, so it now has a substantial number of battleships and then later a substantial number of carriers in theaters of 43, 44 onwards, you've then got a fleet mix and a fleet build-up and a fleet capability that is so different from the slow battle line handful of fast carriers that they had to play with in the fleet problems, that while they can draw some vaguely general principles, a mixture of war experience and the changing balance of the fleet means that very little from the fleet problems is directly applicable by the mid-part of World War II. Nick Brodar asks, will we ever get an explanation of Warspite's 15-inch rapid-fire order from the Operation Neptune video? Yeah, well, I can give you one now. I did want to do a follow-up to that video, but the problem is that so much of the naval involvement in the immediate post-D-Day environment is shore-based fire support, unsurprisingly, that you end up in a situation where you're telling as much a history of the D-Day landings and the advances into Normandy on land as you are the ships at sea, because you have to coordinate, well, this ship is firing in support of these troops, and this is why they're firing in support of these troops, and so on and so forth. And as I've said many times before, I'm not a land-based warfare historian, so how many books have been written about the D-Day and the Normandy campaign, sorting through all of them to figure out which ones are the best, and then sorting through all of those good ones to work out what exactly the heck is going on, and then cross-correlating that with all the naval sources. I think it would have to, if I was going to do that in a serious in-depth way, it would have to be in a collaboration with one or more historians who have really studied D-Day and the subsequent campaign in extreme detail. But for that particular order, I can tell you exactly what was happening. So that was in support of the 50th Division, 50th Northumbrians, sometimes called the 50th Tyne and Tees Division. And they were a primarily infantry division. They'd actually landed on D-Day itself, and they were carrying the campaign up into Normandy. However, it turned out that they got a little bit too good, believe it or not, and they ended up a little bit ahead of the front lines, having formed a little salient into German-held territory. Now, ordinarily, that wouldn't be so bad. It's kind of par for the course for the time. Certainly for that campaign, a salient would form, and then either it would be potentially pushed back, but more often other Allied units would come up in support to widen the salient, and it would now become the front line. However, as we said, 50th Division was an infantry division, and some of their forward scouts suddenly found that the particular salient they'd forced meant that they were about to come under attack from elements of both Panzer Lehr Division and 12th SS Panzer Division. And needless to say, a slightly tired single infantry division probably wasn't going to do very well if it was hit from both sides by a pair of panzer divisions. And so rather understandably, they got on the radio system, and they're just like, bunch of German troops and tanks forming up over there. Can you please do something about this before they come after us? And that percolated its way over to Warspite, which was on fire support duty that day for that area. And Warspite's captain just went, oh, okay, you want us to do fire support? Right. What exactly are we shooting at? The forest where all these Germans are gathering. Not a problem. Obviously dials all that into the fire control system, gets a fire control solution, and that's when he rings down and goes, yep, 50 rounds, 15-inch rapid fire, and just starts pelting the forest with thousands and thousands of pounds of high explosive to, shall we say, considerable effect. The Germans were most disconcerted by a sudden rain of 15-inch high explosive battleship shells, and it did rather break up and ruin their attempts to attack 50th Northumbrian, who obviously were then able to continue their advance and saw out the rest of the war in pretty good shape. And of course, what was meant by the rapid fire order was essentially just load the shells and fire them as soon as humanly possible, because, well, the target's not moving that much, so we don't have to wait to spot the fall of shot. And I'm sure if we're very slightly off, the people up front will radio in very quickly and say, oh yeah, adjust the guns a little to the left, a little to the right, whatever. But we can manage that separately. We don't need to wait to spot a shell splash. So essentially, here's the point of aim. We're not moving particularly quickly, so it's not quite a maintained single fire solution, but it's a slow, very basic fire solution the fire control computers have no problem keeping up with. So just fire the shell, and as soon as you get the next shell loaded, send it downwind as fast as humanly possible. And that's pretty much what they did. And that meant that very soon the relatively immobile Germans became very highly mobile Germans. It's just that they were very mobile in pretty much a 180-degree hemisphere all at once. Hark asks, could the Kriegsmarine have been more careful with its use of the Enigma encryption, such as by reducing the number of things they encrypted using it? As to my knowledge, among the arguably many things that led to the breaking of the Enigma system was that the Kriegsmarine used Enigma not just for purely command and control related communications with their subs, but also for more general exchanges of data like reports on the weather. This, as far as I know, gave the codebreakers a specific word to focus on, namely Wetterbericht, or Wetterbericht, possibly, as the meteorological reports began with that word. In your opinion, what sort of data could the Kriegsmarine have transmitted without using Enigma to give fewer points of attack for the codebreakers, and what other options were there to still ensure security for data not encrypted by Enigma? For example, could they have been encrypted using one-time pads instead? Certainly the Germans could have significantly reduced the use of Enigma if they used it purely for command and control, so telling U-boats where to go, where enemy ships were, what intelligence had gathered, or recon reports, that kind of thing. That would have reduced the number of things they needed to use Enigma for. And as you point out, you have certain keywords, or you also have just things which are known apparently in cryptography as depths, and like the depth of the sea, but with a plural S. And apparently this is essentially when somebody sends a message and then they send the message again, or not the same message, but they send a different message, but they use the same encryption settings. So if they keep using the same encryption settings, then obviously, even though all the messages are encrypted, there is a similarity between them, and if you can work out what that similarity is, you're part way to deciphering it. Whereas if you change the settings all the time, or you use different words at the beginning of communications that would otherwise be very similar, then that pattern breaks down, and it's much harder to work out what's going on. Because obviously, as you said, that's the other thing. Is like if you sign off everything with Heil Hitler, then even if you're using multiple different settings all the time, they know that 99% of the time the last section of this message is going to be Heil Hitler, then that gives a relative tie-in between the messages. One-time pads were used, and they were known about during the Second World War, but they tended to be relatively sparsely used for two reasons. Firstly, if you were going to produce a large volume of one-time pads, you could only use very simple cryptological methods, which would make them easy to break, even if just breaking that one message only told you what that message said, versus if you used a more complex one-time pad, you wouldn't be able to produce anywhere near as many of them, and so you reserve them for really important communications. But certainly for things like weather reports, they could have used a simpler or just a different means of encryption. Now, of course, that does increase complexity, because it means if you're receiving reports via multiple encryption methods, you need multiple code books or multiple decipher sheets to work out what on earth is being said. But there would be a number of ways of doing things like weather reports, which would provide a degree of security. But let's face it, at the end of the day, weather reports are just that. If the enemy has intercepted and decrypted your weather reports, in and of themselves, they don't really tell you all that much. Now, if you were transmitting weather reports for a very specific part of the ocean, that might give away something, because people might turn around and go, okay, well, why are they telling everybody out at sea what the weather 200 miles west of Iceland is and not everywhere else in the Atlantic? Maybe it's because there's a bunch of U-boats there. But so at that point, you would want to maybe have encryption that would be strong enough to last, let's say, a few days, so that by the time the enemy knows what it says and then has interpreted why it's being transmitted, that maybe then it doesn't matter, either because the weather's changed or because the tactical situation has changed. And for that, you could come up with a fairly simple, I think, cryptography sheet that would still be somewhat confusing to people. I mean, one example I could think of would be to just have a standard issue dictionary that everybody has to take with you, obviously in German, and then just say, okay, well, on the first day of January, you're going to look at the first page of the dictionary for the letter A, and then on the second day in January, we're going to look at the second page for the letter B, and so on and so forth. And then in February, the first day of February is going to be the first page of words beginning with B, but the second day will be the second page for words beginning with C, for example. So it changes every day of the year, and in a way that is not as easily predictable as, hey, they're just using a bunch of words from the next page in this dictionary. And then on the guide sheet for both the people receiving and the people transmitting the signal, you say, okay, well, on this particular page, the first word will mean stormy. The second word will mean clear skies. The third word will mean cloudy. The fourth word will mean snow, etc. So the words themselves mean the weather. And then for, I don't know, coordinates or direction or something, you could say, okay, well, each of the words after that given word, count forward. So the first word after that word in the dictionary entry is 1, the second word is 2, the third word is 3, etc. And that would allow you to give the coordinates or the wind direction or speed or something, and just have a similar kind of crib sheet. And because a dictionary is obviously not going to be always having exactly the same number of entries and the same number of bits of text after each entry, it's going to be semi-randomized. And then obviously if you know the guide, then you can reverse engineer it pretty quickly. And if you want to throw in a bit of extra complexity, just in case someone back in the UK also has a copy of that dictionary, then you can play around with things. So, maybe on the second day of the month, instead of going first, second, third word means 1, 2, 3, you could go first, second, third word actually means 0, 9, 8, and count backwards and so on and so forth. So I'm going to use an English dictionary for an example, mostly because I can't find a period German dictionary. So if we're transmitting a message on the 1st of May, so that means the first page of the letter E, and we look at our crib sheet, and the 8th word on the page is the equivalent of storms, and we want to transmit storms, so we count down: each, eager, eagerly, eagerness, eagle, eagle-eyed, eagle-stone, eaglet. Okay, great. So we know that eaglet is the 8th word, so eaglet means storms today. So we say eaglet, and we want to say that the storms are 12 degrees north and 7 degrees east. It's very crude, but let's go with it because it's easy at this point. So from eaglet, the 12th whole word is observable, which is actually a word in the entry for eager. And the 7th word is above. So we transmit eaglet observable above. Now, actually, that happens to make a little phrase, but what it actually means is storms 12-7. And if they know it's a standard weather report, that means they know storms at 12 degrees north, 7 degrees. Well, we want it to be east, but, we can come up with something else that lets us work out what east means, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Library of Context asks, when did the era of stone anchors and ropes end and metal anchors and chains begin? Was it a conversion or an adoption for new vessels? There's actually a very interesting question. So the adoption of iron or metal anchors generally over stone anchors was an extremely protracted process. The first references we have to either metal anchors or metal making up a substantial portion of an anchor actually goes back as far as 600 BC to the period of the ancient Greeks and the very early ancient Romans, mostly the ancient Greeks. But metal anchors and stone anchors kind of coexist depending on the size of the ship and the budget of the ship owner for over 2,000 years. It's only really once you start to get into the late 1500s and then into the 1600s that you could reliably say that the bulk of ships are going to be using iron anchors as opposed to hybrids or stone or whatever, because a lot of smaller ships still would use fairly simple anchors. But of course, shortly before that period, it would be more common than not to see iron anchors. It's just not pretty much the default. Chains are a slightly different matter. Iron chains in a nautical use exist for an extremely long time, all the way back again to Alexander the Great, when you very often find iron chains being used to try and stop ships getting into harbour. But the use of iron as an anchor chain has a couple of major problems. Firstly, generic iron chain kinks up quite easily and locks up quite easily, which isn't a good thing for an anchor chain. Secondly, it's quite difficult and expensive to produce at that kind of scale for a good period of time. And thirdly, if you're in an emergency where you have to let go of your anchors, a rope can be cut, an iron chain not so much. And so at that point, it's like, well, how do you safely release and guarantee the release of an anchor chain? And then at the very start of the 1800s, you have two things. Firstly, the stud chain method, or basically the almost figure of eight looking chain, combined with the Industrial Revolution, means you can produce an awful lot of them, plus the invention of the iron shackle, or bolt shackle release, makes it very easy to release such an anchor or anchor chain, while still having all the benefits of the strength of iron without having to introduce some kind of rope link or something, which obviously then limits the whole thing to just the strength of rope, at which point you might as well just use rope anyway. And so in the beginning of the 1800s, suddenly anchor chain begins to very rapidly displace anchor rope. Explicitly Implicit asks, in a fairly recent Q&A, the question was asked as to why are barrels chrome-plated? Taking a closer look at galvanic plating and surface hardening, I was wondering why naval gun barrels weren't plated with stellite or boridized to increase the barrel life. From what I can tell, both processes would cost significantly more than chrome plating a gun barrel. And when you're talking about the sheer size of naval guns relative to even rifles and so forth, that would involve a lot of money and a lot of increase in the gun's cost for a relatively small increase in durability. So for World War I, World War II, and bear in mind, Stellite is only really invented just prior to World War I, it's just not worth it when a pre-existing, much cheaper alternative that offers you almost as good preservation already exists. And also with boridizing a barrel, the resultant material is a little bit brittle, and, well, the extreme forces that are involved in firing a naval gun, including the whipping of the gun barrel, might very well cause that to wear down. So I think boridizing a battleship's gun is probably just materially inadvisable as well as expensive, given the stresses involved. Having a stellite lining, on the other hand, that would potentially offer a mechanically better solution. But as I said, you're going to run into two main issues. One, massive increase in cost. And two, the fact that chrome plating a gun barrel is a much, much easier process than lining it with stellite. I mean, I think, as far as I'm aware, most stellite linings tend to be made and then kind of dropped in physically as opposed to plated. And so it would be a very, very different process. But yeah, so vastly more complex, vastly more expensive. So, do you want to do all of that and set all of that up in exchange for a marginal increase in wear and tear resistance, or do you just go with what you've already got and produce lots of guns? Ark Dennis asks, one of my favourite ever historical anecdotes is the story of the plucky little HMS Africa at Trafalgar, especially how it encounters Santissima Trinidad looking ripe for surrender, only for the boarding party to find it actively engaged on the far side, and the Spanish captain graciously allowing the boarders to depart after realising their mistake. It makes for a fantastic story. But how did this actually happen? We're told that Captain Digby sent Lieutenant Smith over to the Santissima Trinidad by boat, but then suddenly Smith is on the quarterdeck of a huge four-decker talking to Spanish officers. There's a huge mixture of factors going on in this environment. You've got to remember the Battle of Trafalgar, by the point that Africa shows up next to Santissima Trinidad, has been going on for quite some time. And essentially, the ships aren't really moving that much. I mean, they are moving, but they're moving at walking pace or less, because the wind was never particularly strong, and of course they're now in battle sail, and no one's particularly going up to change that while they're shooting at everybody left, right, and centre. So intercepting a ship with a particularly well-rowed boat, especially a ship that wasn't particularly manoeuvrable or quick at the best of times, like Santissima Trinidad, pretty easy. Also, there's a huge amount of black powder gun smoke just lying around, like, literally everywhere. And during this period of the battle, you have descriptions and depictions and mentions by people of ships literally looming up out of the pools of gun smoke at a ship's length or two. So at like deck level, you're basically looking in between patches of gun smoke to try and spot something to shoot at, and probably, making a good assessment of what's going on based more so on what masts are sticking up out of the gun smoke, more so than anything else. Now, of course, if you're on the side where the wind is blowing things a bit away, you're going to get a better view than if you're on the side that the wind is blowing towards. But still, it's not a particularly brilliant or clear view. So that means that, one, people have to be very, very close in terms of ships just to work out who exactly is who. And two, therefore, putting a boat over is not going to take very long, and intercepting is pretty easy. Then you've got to work with the fact that normally when ships are engaging, all the gun crews are on the engaged side. Ships can engage with both sides of their gun batteries in the age of sail, but it requires splitting the gun crews. So if you're starting an engagement and you absolutely have to, you do have enough men to do so. But when you start taking casualties, or if, the enemy's definitely on one side, pretty much everyone on the other side is just going to go back to the engaged side to help out. People, therefore, aren't really going to be looking that far. And there will obviously be a few people looking out just in case an enemy ship appears on your disengaged side. But then again, they're looking for a ship. So if you're looking for masts, if you're looking for a big hull, something like that, you're not going to be looking down at the water for a tiny little boat, because what could a tiny little boat do anyway? And that tiny little boat is probably lost in the general gun smoke. Whereas obviously from the tiny little boat's perspective, you've got this big looming shape, and that's much easier to home in on. So it's entirely understandable at that point in the battle how Africa could set down a boat and it could row a short distance to Santissima Trinidad, and the Spanish just flat out not notice it, because the handful of people who are looking vaguely on that side just would never have been looking for something like that. Then, of course, they get to the ship, and if you've seen Victory or any other of the larger preserved wooden museum ships, you'll know that as well as gangplanks and temporary ladders and stuff, they also tend to have a fixed set of wooden steps, at least one in each side, which is typically used for people coming up on boats. So they're going to row up to that, they're going to climb up, and, in the midst of all the gunfire and the screaming and the yelling, the sounds of a few people climbing up some wooden steps is really going to not be noticed. And then at that point, they're up on the deck. Again, attention is mostly focused on the opposite side, and what few people do recognize them or even notice that they're there, it's a small party of people. They're dressed in the manner vaguely of officers. People see them out the corner of their eye. They're walking unhurriedly. They're not raising their weapons, screaming, attacking people. So if you're a Spanish sailor and you're manning a gun and you're looking at the people that you're actually shooting at and who's shooting back, you see someone vaguely officer-like walking around in your peripheral vision, just like, oh, it's just another officer, whatever. And then, and at that point, the party winds up on the quarterdeck, and they're just like, hi, hello, some attention, please. And the Spanish officer's like, oh, hello, what are you doing? Oh, no, we're not surrendered. No, look over there. There's some of your friends. We're shooting at them. Oh, you thought we had? Oh, you thought we'd surrendered? obviously a very easy mistake to make. I mean, yeah, look at all this gun smoke. Who can tell what's going on in all of this? Okay, right, well, this is a bit awkward. Well, since we're following gentlemanly rules of conduct and you came here under honest pretense, and, well, you're not really much of a threat, how about you go back and tell your captain that, oh, yeah, sorry, we haven't surrendered at this point, and good luck with the rest of the battle. Okay, cool, bye. It's a very different era. Wade Enyart asks, did the Germans ever attempt to enlist the aid of illusionists or magicians in hiding Tirpitz? Well, I think they were certainly enlisting somebody with an unconventional train of thought when they painted her up to look like a brick wall to hide her in, I think it was Wilhelmshaven or Kiel. But as far as I know, when it came to hiding Tirpitz from the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm up in Norway, I don't believe so. As far as I'm aware, they just went with a fairly standard camouflage system adapted for the Norwegian environment, namely, well, just its generic paint and then a ton of smoke generators, because they realized it's pretty impossible to hide something like Tirpitz from general aerial reconnaissance in something like the Norwegian fjords. I mean, what, you're going to hide it, disguise it as an island? Well, everyone knows where the islands in the fjords are, and it's not going to be an iceberg that far up the fjords. So just accept they're going to know roughly where you are, but then when it comes to bombing you, well, yeah, just smother the entire area in smoke, put fighters above, and, well, they hopefully won't be able to see you, which worked to varying degrees, depending on how soon they got notice and how quickly they could deploy the smoke generators. Boris B. asks, can you please explain the difference between pre-dreadnoughts and semi-dreadnoughts? And how many semi-dreadnoughts did Britain build? So believe it or not, there is a little bit of a grey line or a grey area in this respect. So the typical sort of easy rule of thumb definition of a semi-dreadnought revolves around the intent of the secondary battery. So in a typical pre-dreadnought, you have your main battery, which is usually going to be 12-inch guns, but some variation is allowed. And obviously its main purpose is to punch armor-piercing shells into the heart of an enemy ship to destroy it. The secondary battery is then usually, again, a 6-inch battery, give or take an inch or so. And its purpose is to throw large amounts of high explosive very quickly at the enemy to set it on fire. But there's no real intent for those guns to be armor-piercing in any real sense of the word, unless you're engaging cruisers and destroyers and so forth. And for destroyers, you have anti-torpedo, anti-destroyer, tertiary batteries and so forth anyway. But if you're engaging a straight-up battleship, no one's really going to think about your secondary battery actually punching through that battleship's armor, just hopefully smashing things up and setting things on fire. However, you then get the semi-dreadnought, and in the semi-dreadnought, the secondary battery is replaced by a much larger caliber of gun, whose purpose is definitely to punch through enemy armor. Maybe not the belt, although sometimes that is the intention, at least at closer ranges, but they certainly are designed with the idea of punching through at least portions of a battleship's armor protection, and possibly the whole thing, as I said, if you can get close enough. And they are very, very definitely for targeting enemy capital ships and fairly little else. And those tend to be things like 9.2-inch guns, or 10-inch guns, or something like that. And on semi-dreadnoughts, because that is now the secondary battery, you tend to see a complete replacement of the 6-inch or similar guns, and you will just have big, really, really big guns, somewhat big guns, and then your anti-torpedo boat battery. So you'd be looking at things like the Dantons, the Radzetskis, the Satsumas, technically the Kawachis, to a certain degree, and for the British, the Lord Nelsons, and to answer your question, therefore Britain built 2 of them. Then you get into the slightly grey area. So there is this slightly grey area of vessels which do have a high caliber secondary battery, but it's a relatively small one, and they also retain an element of the old secondary battery. So, for example, if you have a look at the Lord Nelsons, they have their 12-inch guns. They then have 10 9.2-inch guns in a mixture of twin and single turrets, it's a 5-gun broadside, and then it goes straight down to 12-pounders, aka 3 inches, which are your anti-torpedo boat armament. And similarly with the Satsumas, at least as Satsuma is constructed, they have 12 10-inch guns as well as their 2 twin 12-inch guns. But then, as I said, the grey area would be things like the Katori class. So the Katoris have 4 10-inch guns and a dozen 6-inch guns. The King Edward the Sevenths in British service, of which obviously they built 8, they have their 12-inch guns. They also have 4 9.2-inch guns, as well as a bunch of 6-inch guns. And technically into that, you can even throw things like the Virginia-class battleships of the US Navy, which have 8-inch guns and 6-inch guns. And some authors will say that those are sort of semi-dreadnoughts on the grounds that, well, they do have this smaller than 12-inch, but still definitely designed for armor-piercing secondary battery, whereas others will say, okay, yeah, they have some of that, but they're still carrying a predominantly 6-inch or equivalent thereof secondary battery, and this is just a small ancillary addition, so does it really count? Make of that argument what you will. Jack Von Kuhn asks, how many Royal Navy ships, let's say starting with Henry VIII and going forwards, have been named Prince of Wales? From what I can tell, the answer is somewhere between 6 and 9, depending exactly on how you classify them. So there have been, for definite, 3 wooden warships named HMS Prince of Wales, all of which were ships of the line of some description, actually going up 3rd rate, 2nd rate, 1st rate. You then have the London-class battleship HMS Prince of Wales, which is the one you can see in the picture just here, the King George V class battleship, of course, in the first half of World War II, and most recently, the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier, HMS Prince of Wales. Where you end up with potentially adding another 3 to those 6 is that contemporaneous with the 2nd rate Prince of Wales, which is the 2nd ship ostensibly to carry the name, there was also a transport that was in Royal Navy service that was called Prince of Wales. But the thing is, its name runs concurrent with the 98 gunner. So at that point, it was probably HM Transport or HMT, not HM Ship. So, you can argue that one. There was another ship, which was a little sloop, actually around about the same time, that was purchased under the name Prince of Wales for the Royal Navy. She then was renamed to a different name. However, she did spend a few months as HMS Prince of Wales, which would have been slightly confusing because that would have been contemporaneous with the 2nd rate, the 98 gunner, which is why she was renamed. But technically speaking, she was very briefly in Royal Navy service as Prince of Wales. But again, I don't know if that so much counts because that's essentially she's been bought under an existing name, but when she's actually commissioned into Royal Navy service, she is sailing under a different name. And then the final and most questionable one would be a customs vessel called Prince of Wales, technically owned by and operated by the government, not part of the Royal Navy, but did sail with the Royal Navy Experimental Squadron in the 1830s. So government operated and government owned and running with the Royal Navy sort of maybe counts. And at that point, there wasn't actually a capital ship Prince of Wales in service, so she's in the clear from that perspective, but also probably not HMS. So personally, I would probably go with 6, but you could stretch it from 6 anywhere up to 9. Camino John asks, have you ever witnessed the naval warfare at Peasholm Park in Scarborough? Have you been invited to join in? And if you were asked to build and bring your own scale ship, which ship would it be? Bonus question, if it had to be a ship that needed to be sunk, which one would it be? I haven't been there. I've thought about going. I think at one point, I can't remember, a year or 2 ago, I think someone invited me to come up and watch it. I wasn't able to because I had different travel commitments at the time, but I do want to go and see it at some point. If I was asked to bring and build my own scale ship, I'd I'd probably build HMS Rodney, especially because at that kind of scale that they run at, you could just sit and lounge in it and use the all-forward armor, just a really long area to put your legs, at least for the larger vessels. And to be honest, Rodney anyway, just because I like the ship. If it was a ship that very specifically needed to be sunk, I'll probably build HMS Exeter. That's quite a cool-looking ship. Possibly Exeter or York. They're odd little mini heavy cruisers, but I just do like the lines of them. Dennis from Houston asks, "Thank you for answering my Panzerschiff propulsion question. After thinking about your answer for a while, I think I may have come up with an alternate suggestion. Using a 3-shaft propulsion idea, could it be done where the outer 2 shafts are attached to a high-speed, high-pressure turbine and, using small tube boilers, separated into groups of 2, with the high-pressure turbines then dumping their waste steam into the low-pressure ahead-only centerline turbine, and with a little creative steam pipe work, have a single set of boilers that could drive the low-speed turbine, with the various boiler sets switching from time to time to allow for maintenance. With the necessary pumps and hoses installed, the Panzerschiff in question could then siphon the required bunker sea fuel from prizes, and this system, at least in my mind, would be better than a split steam and diesel system." I mean, in theory that could work, but the main advantage would just be running the low-pressure turbine on its own from a limited boiler set, because obviously that you'd be able to generate low-pressure steam with relatively little fuel compared to going at full speed, and you could adapt a specific low-pressure boiler set which would not use as much fuel. The idea of splitting the steam from the high-pressure turbines on the outer shafts to the low-pressure on the inner shaft, yes, you could do it, but you are going to run into the issue that for the most efficient use of high-pressure turbine sets, most high-pressure turbines already have a low-pressure turbine which their steam runs into, and so if you're diverting steam from the high-pressure turbine to the central shaft, then you're either losing efficiency on that outer turbine, or you're running it through a high pressure, then a low pressure, or I guess you could call it an intermediate pressure at that point, and then to a low pressure. So you're going to get fairly little energy out of that central turbine. So an adaptation of that could work, but it'll be difficult to do. Andrew Dederer asks, "One lesson of the US Civil War was that only fortifications on bluffs were of much use in stopping ironclads from moving up and down rivers. Did this carry over to any other contemporary fortifications? I would guess that the move to longer range guns changed things again, but I can't help thinking that some highly placed guns would have been very handy in Oscar's Fjord in 1940, if an absolute pain to resupply with ammunition." Well, having your fortification guns on a high point did afford a number of advantages. Obviously, with rivers, specifically in the US campaign, there were some very specific ones about distance that you could actually see, being able to fire somewhat round corners and so forth. But more generally, apart from the obvious, if you fire from higher up, you have a slight range advantage at a given elevation, there is another rather significant defensive advantage, and that is that certainly in the time of the US Civil War, if your guns are high enough up, your opponent may not actually be able to engage you at close range, where their own guns are the most accurate, because the elevation that they'll need to use will be too high, and that forces them to engage you from a longer distance where they're less accurate, and if they close in and they can't shoot at you, it's easier to depress guns in an open fortification than it is to elevate guns on an enclosed gun deck, or turret, or whatever. Another advantage is that even if your opponent can shoot up, relatively speaking, at you, if you're on the level with them, then obviously a direct hit is a direct hit. A slight overshoot is still going to hit you. A shot that would have landed 50 yards behind, because it's coming mostly horizontal, is still going to hit you. And even a shot that hits a little bit short is probably going to throw up debris and so forth that, even if it doesn't damage the gun, might damage the gun crew. Whereas if you're high on a bluff or in a fortification of some kind, then a short round is going to hit somewhat below you, and therefore, there's still a possible risk of shrapnel, but it's much reduced, and any shot that would go slightly long, i.e. that's slightly high, is just going to go sailing over your head and go off into the wild blue yonder, which makes your guns somewhat more durable compared to if you're at near peer elevation with vessels. And those kinds of principles generally carry over into coastal fortifications and have been known when it comes to coastal fortifications before the US Civil War. Obviously, the US Civil War is the first major and extensive conflict fought with ironclads on both sides, and fairly large numbers of them. And so there are some specifics to how to engage ironclads and particular advantages, especially in riverine warfare, that come out of the American Civil War. But essentially, what that is doing is it's confirming and modifying a pre-existing body of knowledge rather than coming up with anything particularly new. HMAS Albatross asks, the Regia Mariner's battleship modernizations are sometimes written off as a waste of time and resources, as they did not make the ships competitive with any of the Royal Navy's capital ships in World War II. However, I understand that the aim of their modernizations was actually to counter the Marine Nationale's battle line up to and including the Dunkirks. Is this the case, and if so, how would you rate their chances against each of the Marine Nationale's classes of battleships compared to their original configuration? So the answer is yes. As originally envisaged, the Italian dreadnought modernizations were supposed to be primarily directed against the Marine Nationale rather than the Royal Navy. Of course, by the late 30s, they were also thinking about possibly fighting the Royal Navy, but at that point, well, A, they'd already pretty much started most of the modernizations, and B, a modernized capital ship is considerably more capable than an unmodernized one, even if it's still at something of a disadvantage. So, going back to the Marine Nationale, comparing them to the three battleship classes that the French had available in the 30s, against the Corbett's, the Italian refits have a distinct advantage. They are fast enough in their modernized forms to completely dictate the range, and they can sit back at a fair old distance and plug away at the Corbett's. And obviously, the Corbett's not being particularly heavily modernized would be in big trouble. Against the Britannias, it's a little bit of a different issue. So for the Britannias, they'd have to be under 20,000 yards in order to penetrate with the 12.6-inch modified guns. But again, they have a speed advantage such that they can completely dictate the range at which they're actually going to be fighting. The Britannias can't close and they can't run away unless the Italians want to let them do so, which is a bit of a problem, obviously, if you happen to be on the French side of things. And then up against the Dunkirks, well, then you're in a rather interesting scenario, because at least Dunkirk, as opposed to Strasbourg, you're in a situation where both sides are equally vulnerable to each other's shells within all reasonable versions of events at practical battle ranges. And the Dunkirk is obviously faster, so can now dictate the range, which up until now the Italian modernizations have been able to do. However, the speed difference is not as great as the speed difference between the Italian refits and the Corbett's and Britannias. And while you do have to turn broadside on, whereas the Dunkirk can maintain pretty much a dead straight bearing if it wants to, you do have two more guns. So, it's certainly not going to be a painless process, but the Italian modernized dreadnoughts could certainly go toe-to-toe with the Dunkirk, whereas in their unmodernized forms, while they would have an additional gun, the massive speed difference involved would allow the Dunkirks to completely choose when and where the engagement happened. Colin Olson asks, which ship could have given more useful service but was scrapped before it reached its full potential? And conversely, which ship was held on too long to the point where it was a detriment to the Navy? In the latter case, I think HMS Prince Albert definitely takes the cake. She's a small, even by the standards of the time, coastal defence ironclad of the mid-1860s. Ships of her style and type were of questionable value when they were launched, and for the most part, when you look at similar vessels, they're either in reserve or out of service in most navies in about 10 to 15 years, so kind of the mid-1870s going on to the start of the 1880s. And indeed, the handful of other similar ships the Royal Navy builds like this at the time also are gone by about that point. Unfortunately for the Royal Navy, it's called Prince Albert. And by the time the Royal Navy's kind of looking at it going, yeah, we don't really want this anymore, the actual Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband is dead, and Queen Victoria ain't letting them get rid of it. So the poor old thing gets to stay in service for literally decades. She's even put into the Spithead Naval Review in the late 1880s and then dragged along with essentially the very end of the ironclad period vessels at the very end of the 1880s. And it's only when you're in the middle of the pre-dreadnought period at the very end of the 19th century that somebody finally manages to either persuade the Queen or possibly just shuffle some papers around in a way that she doesn't notice and gets this poor old thing sent off to the scrappers literally the year before we get into the 20th century. For about 30 years, this thing was just an unnecessary cost expenditure for the Royal Navy, but they couldn't get rid of it because otherwise the Queen would be very angry with them. And for ships that were scrapped before they reached their full potential, I think you could probably make an argument in two different directions immediately off the top of my head. One would be HMS Vanguard, especially because the Royal Navy was looking explicitly for a Sverdlov-class cruiser killer. Vanguard is about the best you're going to get in terms of everything you've got in the inventory at that point. And yes, there were some issues with Vanguard, but she's a heck of a lot better at killing an arbitrary number of Sverdlovs than a couple of World War II era light cruisers, which is what they went for in the end. And given the continuous evolution of the air threat and various other things as well, I think she also would have made a superb trials and experimental vessel as well as fleet flagship. Because, there were some concerns about weight, especially after her conversion to a royal yacht. But what you could very easily do at that point is say, okay, well, we're going to keep the 15-inch guns because they're our Sverdlov killers. And yes, the air threat has probably moved a little bit beyond the 5.25-inch guns. We really need some kind of automatic weapon, and probably the Bofors as well. So you keep maybe 3 or 4 of the Bofors installations for close-range engagements. Obviously, all the rest of them would be gone, and also take out the 5.25-inch guns and their mountings, barbettes, etc. That's going to save you a huge amount of weight. And given that you have things like some of the early surface-to-air missiles like Seacat and so forth, designed in part to replace older gun-based systems, then you can put some of those in instead, and in place of the secondary battery, then nicely placed. They give her updated powers of resistance against incoming attacks. And because she's got this capacity down the side, then you can continue to use her almost experimentally as well as being a fleet flagship. So when you start developing things like Sea Dart or Seawolf, you can take out some of the Seacat launchers and install an experimental mounting or two. And then if it works, which obviously with Sea Dart and Seawolf they did work, then you can just wholesale replace the Seacat systems. But you've still got the Seacat systems there as insurance against it potentially not working. And if you really, although this would require a fair bit of rebalancing of the ship, but if you really, 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 really want to save weight because you want to do a massive overhaul to modernize her, you could even argue for losing 1 or 2 of the 15-inch turrets. Either remove X turret, the super-firing aft turret, or remove both rear turrets. Because if you remove both rear turrets, you could probably make an argument for removing the aft fire control systems as well, which would potentially open up things like a larger helicopter landing deck aft, more missile systems, etc. I'm sure at some point some lunatic would have suggested putting some Harriers on there if she'd lasted long enough. Although personally I would say maybe put a couple of twin Sea Dart launchers in place and give them really, really deep magazines. Replace the aft fire control system with radar, and then have maybe a few Seawolf launchers down either side. Something like that. She could have given a lot of good service as a very premier Royal Navy flagship for a long time, as opposed to being carted off in the middle of the 50s because somebody thought they could save some money and ended up not doing so. The other one which I would potentially pencil in there would actually be the British R-class submarines, the World War I hunter-killer types. The reason I say that is that most of them were gone pretty quickly after the war, and the few that stuck around were used mostly as high-speed underwater targets for underwater anti-submarine warfare training. But although ASDIC was a thing, and submarine ASDIC was becoming a thing during the interwar period, they seem to have been let go right before people started seriously thinking about putting ASDIC on submarines as a way of locating enemy targets, especially underwater targets. And given the advanced nature of the R-class as far as being essentially the first hunter-killers, I think if they'd kept them around for maybe 4 or 5 more years, they could have put a prototype underwater, specifically configured underwater ASDIC, on an R-class to determine its utility, then tested it as an underwater hunter of submarines once again. Instead of just using hydrophones and shotgunning in the general direction, you get a much more precise idea of where the enemy submarine is, and then obviously use it again in the same anti-submarine exercises, except this time hunting other Royal Navy subs. And I think at that point, that may then have proved the utility of the concept enough that the U-class, which, as I covered in a video, almost ended up being designed as R-class successors, might actually genuinely be designed as high-speed underwater submarine hunters, which could have had a very interesting impact on the Second World War if the German U-boats, Italian subs, and even to a certain extent Japanese subs were being terrorized by small, fast vessels designed specifically to hunt them down. Paul from Chicago asks, I was rereading Corbett's Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. Early in the book, Corbett makes a point about the use of cruisers to support battleships and battle fleets versus exerting control upon the oceans. He cites Nelson's difficulties in the Mediterranean to demonstrate the cruiser plus battleship versus cruiser plus control conundrum, and he praises Nelson's use of cruisers and control of the sea. However, as I understand it, Nelson's time in the Mediterranean is nowadays generally understood as a less than spectacular demonstration of command. Indeed, post the Nile, perhaps even something of a failure. Is Corbett too eager to praise Nelson? Or should we distinguish between Nelson's early command in the Mediterranean while still under Jervis's oversight versus his later command under Keith? Or is it something else entirely? I think, in very broad strokes, much as I sometimes point out that, when you're looking at someone like Churchill, especially in World War II, Churchill is, at least to my mind, broadly speaking, a good leader, as long as he's kept at the macro scale. Just don't let him need the fine details of things, because that's when things go horribly wrong. Nelson also kind of has the thing he's really good at, but then, much like you even see people these days who are really good at something, but then assume they therefore must be good at something else. Or, sometimes you see people on YouTube who are just like, I am an expert on this, but therefore clearly I am an expert on everything, or everything even tangentially related to this thing. And then obviously start tripping themselves over. I mean, it would be like me going, okay, I'm a naval historian who focuses on pre-1950. Now I'm going to tell you everything about the 21st century state of naval affairs, which I know a reasonable amount about, but not anywhere near as much as I know about pre-1950. Or worse still, if I was going, well, now I'm going to tell you all about tanks and land warfare, which again, I know something about, but nowhere near enough for me to sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours about it with any hope of accuracy. Or worse still, I start a lifestyle blog or some equally inane nonsense. Anyway, that aside, with Nelson, Nelson's really good at winning battles. Nelson's also pretty good at finding the enemy and pinning them down to then force a battle and win it. In the Mediterranean, he does make a very valid point that his efforts are predicated around having a good, strong frigate force, or cruiser force, if you like, in order to do the scouting for him, because he wants to keep his fleet together and trained and ready to smash the enemy at the first opportunity. He doesn't want to scatter his fleet to the four winds, and if he can't do that, then obviously he needs a large frigate force. He doesn't have it, he constantly complains about it, but he does make relatively good use most of the time of the ones that he does when he's got anything close to an adequate number. For example, actually, the whole rush over to Egypt, where he gets to Egypt before the French invasion force, and then he leaves, and then the French actually show up, and then he has to come back, and then you have the Battle of the Nile. That whole thing can, in part, be blamed on a lack of frigates, because if he had maybe twice the number of frigates he actually did, then their scouting line could have been considerably wider, and they probably would have found the French fleet while it was en route, which would have resulted in a rather interesting at-sea battle, because then the French would also have to protect all the transport ships full of troops. But that's kind of the narrow focus. Can Nelson fight battles at sea? Can he find the enemy at sea when he's got the resources? Does he know how to command at sea? Yes, he does. And I think that's the bit that Corbett is mostly looking at. The problem with Nelson in the Mediterranean is that apart from the Battle of the Nile, for the most part, it's either blockade duty and chasing down the odd enemy ship, which, okay, fine, he does fairly well at, within reason, but a good chunk of his time in the Mediterranean is also spent having to deal with affairs ashore. And it turns out that just as good a commander as he is at sea, it's almost like he's the inverse of that when it comes to land operations. It's like, for the Napoleonic Wars, you could almost say, let the Duke of Wellington fight the land battles, let Nelson fight the sea battles, never swap those over. Because the minute Nelson starts trying to conduct land campaigns, it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. As you can see here, first stint in the Mediterranean, he's fought the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, he's got great acclaim. He then tries to seize Spanish treasure on Tenerife and ends up losing his arm for it. And the less said about his attempts to be a grand land strategist for the Neapolitan campaign, the better. So yes, overall, when you take those kinds of things into account, as an overall naval commander, Nelson's time in the Mediterranean isn't, all singing, all dancing glory. You've got the Nile, you've got a couple of other engagements, but there are these really big screw-ups, including particularly the Neapolitan campaign. But when it comes to Corbett, I think Corbett is almost entirely looking at Nelson and his maritime exploits rather than Nelson trying to play Alexander the Great. Vokir asks, I just finished reading the Neptune's Inferno Tin Can Sailors and Fleet at Flood Tide anthology, and loved its narrative non-fiction nature centering around the experience of certain individuals. I just picked up Who Can Hold the Sea, but can you recommend any other series of books that present their subjects in such an engaging manner? Well, if you like that style of writing, I can immediately think of 3 authors that definitely have a similar kind of style. One very related to what you're reading there by Jim Hornfisher is Ian W. Toll. He also covers the Pacific War and writes in a very similar style to Hornfisher. Another one would be a pair of books, Dreadnought and Castles of Steel by Robert K. Massey, and shockingly enough, that details the run-up to and then the actual First World War, mostly focusing on the Anglo-German naval arms race and the subsequent battles that they fought. And the other one, which I can recommend, or the other author, would be Julian Thompson. And for those of you who may have twigged at that name, yes, he was in fact in command of the Royal Marines in the Falklands War. But the reason I can recommend him is that it's slightly different to the other authors' writing styles, but he's written the Imperial War Museum Book of the War at Sea, which you can see on screen now, which was my first serious history book, bought for me when I was about 5 or 6. And there's also an Imperial War Museum Book of the War at Sea for World War I, also written by him. He's done a bunch of other books, shockingly enough, a bunch about the Falklands, but he's also done one about Dunkirk. And similar to the others, he focuses on the human element of the stories as well as the grand overarching strategy. And particularly with the 2 Book of the War at Sea for World War I and World War II, as I've mentioned before on the channel, I think they're really good introductions to the subject because they don't go into massive detail about any single engagement. But what they are is essentially short sets of paragraphs describing, okay, this is the situation, this is the date, this is what's happening. And then the majority of the rest of the recounting of what's going on is given over exclusively to accounts from the people who were there themselves. And that gives you a really good idea of what it was like to actually be there and have to deal with those situations rather than, just the grand overarching, ship A shot at ship B exploded. Silent Service Gaming and Music asks, if HMS Furious got a rebuild just before World War II that extended her flight deck to be full length and her exhaust was rerouted to take up less overall space for more hangar space, how much more effective would she have been in World War II, and would there be a chance she would see a longer post-war life? She has the potential to be an incredibly effective carrier, if a somewhat odd one. Now, hopefully, as you can see from the photo here, which is Furious in her actual historical configuration, she has a few issues. She has 2 hangars. And this is quite interesting because overall she actually has more hangar space just than a Yorktown class carrier, but a much smaller air group. And the reason for that is twofold. One, the exhaust trunking further aft massively cuts down on the width of one of the hangars, which doesn't help. But secondly, as I hope you can especially see here from this, you've got all sorts of additional fixtures and fittings like the ship's boats and so forth mounted outside of those hangars, and that cuts the hangar width down still further. So for reference, a Yorktown class's hangar is around about 550 foot long, but it's over 60 feet wide, whereas Furious has a 550 foot long lower hangar and a 520 foot long upper hangar, but at its absolute widest point for either of those hangars, you're only looking at 50 feet. So you're losing 13 feet, which, if the wings are folded, is essentially one entire column of aircraft, and it drops another 15 or so feet in the area around where the trunking is, only down to about 35 feet. So if I was going to go to the expense and the extent of doing the kind of refit that you suggest, the other thing I would look at with Furious is that each of those hangars is only about 15 feet tall. So I would go, okay, if we're going to extend the flight deck and retrunk it, so we're giving her an island at this point as well, you will have to be a little careful with hull strength, because ultimately she is based on a Courageous class hull. But my temptation would be to strip off everything that was done to convert her above the main deck of her original hull and completely rebuild it, move all of the ancillary equipment, so it's including the ship's boats and everything, down to what is, previously speaking, the lower hangar, and bulk everything out just a little bit. So you would only have one hangar, which would be in place of the upper hangar, roughly speaking. What was the previous lower hangar deck, as I said, is now more of a supporting the ship's boats, all the other ancillary stuff that's usually stuck on the side, with the exception of the anti-aircraft guns, and obviously also in the closer in interior space, maybe make it a spares and repairs area. So for repairing aircraft that are damaged, storing spare aircraft and broken down parts and so forth. And obviously that deck height can be a little bit lower for the most part. And then when you're rebuilding the upper hangar, build it a little bit higher, maybe 17, 18, 19 feet tall. And as you said, make it full length, trunk everything up with a starboard island. And now suddenly you have an aircraft carrier that's going to have a flight deck length that is approximately similar to a Yorktown class, because the Yorktown class's hull at the waterline is 770 feet. Furious is actually slightly longer, 786 feet. So if you did a full hull length flight deck with maybe a little bit of overhang, the British do like that, then you're probably going to end up with 820, 830 foot long flight deck. Nice tall hangar. And because you're extending the flight deck and essentially the upper works fore and aft, you can actually even extend that hangar. And because you haven't got all the ship's boats and stuff on either side on that level, you can widen it as well. So try and make it roughly as wide as the Yorktown's, maybe a bit longer. You're still not necessarily going to have exactly the same air group as Yorktown, because you will get thinning down fore and aft a little bit sooner. Also, obviously, you're not going to be operating exactly the same aircraft. You're not going to be doing a deck park for the most part, like the Yorktowns did. But I think, getting a realistic 70 to 80 strong air group, assuming everybody's got folding wings, would be entirely doable in that case. It would be a huge refit, and it would cost an awful lot. But to be honest, it wouldn't cost that much more than doing a full flight length extension and ripping out all the trunking anyway, because that's the bulk of the work you'd want to do in any case. Duke Master asks, in the World War I period, the Royal Navy seemed quite content with gun barrel skirts on many of its turreted guns, and yet by World War II most new builds dispensed with them. Even Vanguard's boridized 15-inch guns seem to have lost their skirts compared to the original fit-out. Is there a known reason for this? It's actually a combination of two factors. Firstly, the gun barrel skirts, blast bags, whatever you want to call them, the canvas things that tend to sort of, if you like, they don't attach the two together, but they look like they do. They look like they attach the turret and the gun together, especially when you're building models and stuff. The first thing is those are there to stop water getting in as just a matter of day-to-day course. They are in fact removed when the ship is being made ready for action or when action is anticipated. So even though a lot of photos of World War I era British ships will show them attached, and indeed many other nation ships at that point as well, they're not always. As you can see here, this is HMS Vanguard's World War I predecessor, and as you can see, she's been made ready for action, and she doesn't have them in place in this photo. I mean, the photo is much larger. I've just zoomed in so that you can see the turrets in a bit more detail. And so when you look in World War II, obviously during World War II, quite a lot of the time the photos are of the ships cleared for action. So even if they had them, very often they would have been removed. It's not 100% happening all the time, but they generally should be, according to regulations. The other thing is that if you look very closely at lots and lots and lots of close-up shots of Vanguard and King George V and the various other King George V's, while they can sometimes seem not to have them at all, when you look at the close-up detail, you notice that actually what seems to have happened is that the very large, very baggy canvas bags that were attached to older ships have been replaced by more modern and updated ones that are a lot more conformal in the case of some of the King George V's, and by post-war and with Vanguard actually not necessarily replaced completely as a material, but they no longer reach out from the gun mantlet and smother the gun. They're kind of almost a conformal fit piece that slots in and is removed, because you can see the height level and the color change quite often when you flick through enough of the photos. It's like, okay, so there's some kind of essentially insertable, presumably rigid or semi-rigid seal that they're now using in the more modern period versus the older canvas bags and so forth. There's also in some ships a degree of optical sighting involved, which is why you need to get rid of them, but that's a secondary issue when we're talking about the differences between the World War I and II vessels. Sage of Irrelevance asks, it's fairly common knowledge, at least among your watchers, that Japan was hoping for a decisive battle between its capital ship fleet and the US capital ship fleet during World War II. One problem amongst others with this plan is that Japan never really built a battle fleet that could actually carry that out. The Yamatos were too few in number, the Congos were too poorly protected, the Fusos and the Iseis were too slow. This train of thought eventually led me to the idea of a Vanguard-style program, with Japan taking the guns and turrets from the Congos, Fusos and Iseis and using them to build a class of small fast battleships, either 10 armed with 4 sets of twin 14-inch guns or 8 armed with 5 sets of twin 14-inch guns, while also possibly converting the Congo hulls into aircraft carriers. The idea is for the Yamatos to act as the main anchors for the battle line, while the smaller battleships provide the mass to keep the Yamatos from getting mobbed. Would it have been a practical idea for Japan to attempt this, and which of the two options I listed do you think would work best for them? And would it have made a difference in the war? Well, with this kind of scenario, we do have to be a little bit careful when it comes to exercising too much hindsight, because remember, the Fusas and Iseis weren't slow compared to the US battle line as of December 7th, 1941. In fact, they were faster. The US battle line was the slowest major battle line of all the fleets. That, of course, would change during the Second World War, because the US battle line shifted from being the old 21-knot standards to 27, 28-knot North Carolinas and South Dakotas, and then, of course, 33+ knot Iowas. And the Japanese idea was to, of course, use a combination of carriers, destroyers, and cruisers and submarines to torpedo and bomb enough of the US battle line such that when it eventually arrived, it would be very badly depleted and or damaged, and therefore, the Yamatos are designed to take on at least 2 standards at any given time, so obviously they're planning on building 4 of them, but even with Yamato and Musashi, they're effectively, according to Japanese standards, worth 4 battleships, and the Fusas and Iseis are another 4, so that would mean the US Pacific Fleet, as long as it was reduced to 8 or less, would theoretically be an even match for the Japanese battle line. Throw in the Congos to provide some additional firepower, and you're onto a winner. So, given that the US has some battleships in the Atlantic Fleet, you've effectively just, quote-unquote, got to sink 4 or 5, or badly damage 4 or 5 American battleships to an extent they can't participate in the battle, and anything beyond that is a bonus. However, of course, that is a lot of what-ifs, and assuming that the Americans actually want to come out to play in that particular scenario. So, with all that said, would it be an idea to redo the Japanese battle line like you describe? Well, I think converting the Congos into aircraft carriers, if you were going to do this, wouldn't be too bad of an idea. They're a little bit shorter than some ships, but that were converted into carriers, and some actual carriers, but they are longer than others. So you'd get probably a 50, 60-ish air group out of them. Kind of similar to the Hio and Junyo, only, built to military standards. But your single biggest problem is going to be shipyard space. This is essentially the single big problem with any idea of Japan building up more shipping than it actually historically does in the run-up to World War II. They only have a given number of large dockyards and a given size of economy. So they hit that they do hit that production ceiling pretty much with the efforts they're putting in to build ships, and there's not a lot of headroom involved to increase production. Now, you could look at it in one of 2 ways. You could either argue that maybe as some kind of public works program in the early 30s or something, the Japanese actually invest a lot of money in massively expanding their shipyards. That could be one thing, but that would obviously be them using a lot of foresight. Who knows, maybe they start it when it becomes clear that the First London Naval Treaty is going to further extend the capital shipbuilding holiday. Now, if they had done that, they could, in theory, stack a bunch of battleship production ready to go for the end of the First London Naval Treaty, so in the mid-1930s, because by the mid-1930s, the Congos and the Fusos would have aged out by treaty restriction, and the Iseis would be almost aged out. They'd age out in 37, but the treaty allows you to start building replacements up to 3 years before. So if you're aiming for 1935, if you've got the shipyard space, then Japan could go, okay, well, look, everything except the Nagatos is massively overage. We're just going to do a wholesale replacement program. The question is then, what exactly do you build? My temptation would be that if they are still trying to vaguely stick within the terms of the treaties, you probably take something like the Congo-class replacement designs, the really compact 35,000 tonners that were supposed to carry 16-inch guns that were designed in the early 30s, and you just go, okay, we will replace the 3 1616s with 4 twin 14s and build a bunch of those. Because honestly, putting 5 twin 14s, you're going to really stretch the Citadel and push the whole design way over the limit. Also, while they have significant problems with reserve buoyancy, given how compact their Citadels are, those things are hilariously well protected for 35,000 ton designs. So at that point, having only 8 14-inch guns, well, if you upgrade them with increased elevation, you've got a really tough, fast ship, etc. The fact that they're slightly lacking in barrel count firepower versus their American standard counterparts is probably significantly offset by a mixture of numbers and, numbers, range, and durability. If, however, the Japanese know that they are going to probably walk on Second London, then I'd probably go with the 5 twin 14-inch option, because yes, you get 2 less battleships, but it puts your gun count up to 10 as opposed to most of the American standards with 12. It's a lot closer, and again, modern construction, higher speed, heavy protection. You could certainly make an argument that that kind of ship would be, roughly speaking, a match for the American standard battle line, and at that point you would probably have to go a little bit beyond the 35,000 tons to get something that was as protected as the Congo replacement designs. But it all hinges on essentially where is Japan finding the yard space to do all of this. Kersendarken asks, letters of marque are interesting in part because they're internationally recognised authorizations to essentially be a pirate, something otherwise universally abhorred. Were there other types of letters that a ship or captain could be issued with that had both widespread recognition and authorised otherwise similarly poor behaviour? I think it is important to put a few qualifiers in there, because most letters of marque restricted who exactly the bearer could go after. They weren't kind of, oh, well, you can attack absolutely anyone on the high seas. It was usually the specific enemies that nation wanted to target, with perhaps a little bit of leeway here and there. But also, the letters of marque generally would hold a privateer to a certain level of conduct. So, yes, their actions were piratical in the sense that they were private citizens engaging in commerce warfare, but whereas a pirate didn't really have any restrictions beyond their own personal moral code as to who they attacked or how they treated the people that they attacked, privateers, at least in theory, did have those restrictions placed on them from above. So, and a lot of that behaviour change is, as well as obviously the letter itself, is what distinguishes a privateer from a pirate. But with that said, obviously some privateers could act a lot closer to pirates than, let's say, auxiliary warships, which is theoretically what they were supposed to be. Now, I'm not aware in the time period the channel covers of similar letters of authorization to a letter of marque. And obviously the letters of marque come under various headings. Some people call them privateer charters. Officially, they're technically letters of marque and reprisal, but they're all the same thing, just under slightly different titles. About the only thing I could think of which would authorize an otherwise private citizen to take military force against their country's enemies, but is perhaps a little fuzzier on exactly how they want to conduct themselves while doing so, would be the case of planned, or in some cases ad hoc, civilian maritime militias. So the kind of thing that the US was looking to try and defend itself with for the first couple of decades of its existence, and you'd also see similar things cropping up in various European states at various points. And those are essentially they're not issued with specific letters of marque and reprisal, but they're kind of drafted in as, if you like, naval auxiliaries. So they're operating under government auspices, but they are still private citizens with their own craft, even if some of their equipment may be issued by the state. And that because they're not strictly enlisted in the military, they do have a little bit more leniency when it comes to their behaviour. Although exactly how much leniency very often will depend on the nation in question. And there's kind of a sub-variant of that, which is especially in the 15th, 16th century, a little bit in the 14th as well, where major fleets, including obviously the fleet that went after the Armada, were made up partially of royal ships, but partially also of just privately owned merchant ships with guns and privately owned warships that all showed up. And they all agreed they're under the command of the appointed royal officers, the admirals, etc. However, while they would be recognised as operating under the auspices of, in this case, of the Armada, the English fleet, technically a bunch of those ships are not royal warships, and again, at least on paper, would be subject to slightly different disciplinary expectations compared to one of the royal vessels. Trigfur asks, could you cover some successful uses of shore-based torpedo batteries and command-detonated mines? The only shore-based torpedo sinking I can think about is Blucher, at least deliberately so. And what methods were used to determine when a ship was over a command-detonated mine? I can see where coordinating between multiple command stations would allow for precise control through intersecting bearings, but how would a single station avoid ranging errors when visually triggering mines? As far as I'm aware, Oscarsborg taking out Blucher is pretty much the only known success of or major success, I should say, of a shore-based torpedo battery taking out a warship in actual conflict, as opposed to various tests and the occasional accident. Command-detonated mines, on the other hand, have a somewhat greater success rate. There's a whole slew of Union ships sunk by Confederate command-detonated mines in the American Civil War, for instance. This is a depiction of the USS Commodore Jones being blown up by a command-detonated mine, and of course the now salvaged ironclad either Cairo or Cairo, apparently either way is apparently done in the States, was also sunk by a command-detonated mine, along with a bunch of other ships, as I said. As for how command-detonated mines worked, well, obviously, if you have multiple either command stations or a command station with multiple observation points, your best bet for working out where a ship is relative to the minefield would be to triangulate. However, even if you perhaps would only have a single observer, there are a number of ways in the early days to work out when and where you need to detonate certain mines. Firstly, when the mines are being deployed, you would make a very accurate chart of exactly where they were, and then you would, if you only had the one observer, you would have to look for certain landmarks, and knowing where you are, you could look at a map and go, okay, well, if I'm seeing these landmarks, then I'm looking in this direction, and then make a range estimate. Obviously, later on, as rangefinders become a thing, you can get a bit more accurate with that. And again, in the early days, to try and help out with that, you would often either position the observation point where you had quite a lot of different potential landmarks to work with, or they'd put landmarks out. I'll say landmarks, buoys. So if you had, say, 3 strings of command-detonated mines, then you might put a buoy at either end of each of those strings. Now, of course, as a buoy floating around near the coast is not going to attract too much suspicion. People are, it's just marking some shallow water or something. But if you, as the observer, know, right, well, let's say this red buoy here and that one over there, the line between them shows where the individual mines are, and then you can look at your chart and go, okay, well, there's 15 mines along this or 10 mines along this, spaced evenly, and then you see a ship coming in, you can mentally draw a line and go, okay, he's going to cross that line soon, and based on my estimation, he's going to cross it about a third of the way along. Look at the chart, okay, a third of the way along, that's that mine. He's crossing that line now. Okay, activate and destroy, hopefully. Later on, when it came to harbour defence, there were more ways of determining where an enemy ship was, and that was essentially fixed sensors. They could be hydrophones, they could be very often magnetic induction loops, and in some cases, especially when mines were connected up to nets, even pressure sensors. And of course, then those would indicate exactly which mine they were near, because you'd wire it up so that, say, if you put out 24 mines, you put an induction loop next to or underneath or in the vicinity of each one, and you make sure each one is wired up correspondingly. So induction loop 1 is next to mine 1, and so on and so forth. So then if you're looking out and maybe you think there's a submarine in the area, or it's night and someone's sneaking through, or if it's just daytime and you see someone just passing by, you just go, okay, well, the induction loop for mine number 17 has flared up massively. I guess we're detonating mine number 17 and see what happens. Zeppelfart asks, did all German ships at Jutland have their aft funnels painted red? From what I've been able to track down in German language publications, Yes, it seems this was actually the case. It wasn't a particularly bright red. It was, if you're using the GW colour scheme, Mephiston red, that kind of is a kind of a darker red, as opposed to like an Evil Sun Scarlet. Anyway, that aside, I guess you might call it a maroon. It appears from what I've been able to dig up, particularly from one particular German nautical and naval history magazine article, it was that the Germans, if they thought they were going to sail out into battle, and that battle might become obviously quite messy and close range and involve an awful lot of ships, i.e. a major fleet sailing and so forth, they wanted some way of very quickly and easily allowing their fleet to go, this is a friendly ship, don't shoot at it. Or conversely, this ship doesn't have said marking, therefore it must be an enemy ship, therefore shoot at it, at least during the day. And their solution to this was to try and paint the aft funnel of each ship. Now, this wasn't universally done all the time, and colours did vary. So, a kind of ochre yellow was used at points. The red was used at other points, including obviously at Jutland. And as I said, it wasn't always universally applied. So, all of the small German ships at Dogger Bank apparently did have a specific coloration, but the major capital units, the battle cruisers, didn't. Now, outside of a handful of paintings, usually done by people who were there or people who've spoken to people who were there, you won't see, in almost all cases, any photos which show a notable colour shift between the funnels of the German ships. But that's because they were basically doing for operational security. They had this policy of, this will be our marking, but when we sail for battle, we will leave port with our funnels all grey. But then once we're over the horizon and out of sight of any spies who might be working in the port, then we will paint all our ships. And then once we come back into port, then we will repaint the funnel back to grey again. So you'd paint the funnel out at sea, so it'd only be a thing while you were out in action. Now, with that being said, some photos, some rare photos, do exist of German ships at sea during the Battle of Jutland period. So this, for example, is SMS Seydlitz on her way back home, as you can see by all battle damage, taken from the cruiser Pilau before they get back into sight of land. And you can quite clearly see the forward funnel is the same colour as the rest of the superstructure. It's this nice, well, in this it's almost white, but it's grey. It's just the lighting. But you can see the aft funnel is considerably darker, and that's because in this photo that funnel is red. They haven't got into sight of land yet. And if you can track down some original copies of certain images, like this one, which is the German fleet in early June, about a week after Jutland, or at least some of the German fleet at least, this is, again, Seydlitz up front and Prince Regent Luitpold behind. Importantly, Luitpold is facing the other way. So Seydlitz is bow on to us, Luitpold is stern on to us. And you can see that although they have actually taken efforts to repaint the funnels when they came in towards land, you can see it's not been entirely successful because the permanent pale grey paint on the forefunnel of Seydlitz there contrasts rather heavily with what is clearly a funnel that has had a darker colour, i.e. red, painted on it, and then had a quick coat of light grey slapped on it on the way home, and he's noticeably darker. And as I say, with Luitpold, you can see her forefunnel is actually rising up just above Seydlitz's forefunnel, and her aft funnel is somewhat darker again. And you can see this actually showing of this pattern of the forward funnels being brighter and the aft funnels being a little bit darker in a number of other ships in the background as well. So, yeah, the evidence is there. You just have to be very, very careful and knowing where to look. Because, for example, there's actually quite a few copies of this particular image circulating around on the internet, but they're all copies of copies and have usually been color corrected to pure black and white, at which point all the funnels and most of the detailing has all been blown out to white, and you miss the detail. Christopher Dooley asks, from your videos on French pre-dreadnought design and the relative difficulty of invading England, it's clear that geography has had a substantial impact on the naval history of both England and France. How was coastal geography affecting other significant naval powers like Spain, Germany, the United States, etc.? Well, it's funny you should mention those three powers, of course, because, we'll briefly skip away from those to go and look at Japan. Japan, of course, being an island like Britain, has, at least for the period when it was looking to be a really big, powerful navy, actually got a number of advantages in that, well, being an island, you tend to have an awful lot of ports, but also Japan uniquely benefits from being made up of several large home islands. So you have things like the Sea of Japan and the Inland Sea, which offer not just sheltered ports, but also sheltered large stretches of water, which are easy to defend, relatively speaking, which give them a fairly secure set of ports, at least when you don't have, the combined forces of Britain and America come howling down your throat in 1945. Nonetheless, when we're looking at Spain, Germany, and the US, they actually all have, amongst other things, the same problem when it comes to coastal geography, which is, technically speaking, a need to split their fleet in two. Spain has, of course, an Atlantic coast on the northern side of the Iberian Peninsula and a little bit of the northwestern bit. They dearly love to have the rest of the western bit, but that's called Portugal, and Portugal has a habit of kicking them out every so often when the Spanish try and go Iberian Union, Mark, whatever it is these days. Anyway, Spain also has a southern coast and, importantly, a Mediterranean eastern coast. And that means that with Portugal sitting in the way, and latterly also Gibraltar, Spain has to think about dealing with mostly Atlantic powers, so Britain, other Northern European powers, and the Atlantic element of the French, while also having to think about dealing with the Mediterranean portion of various powers, so the Mediterranean portion of France, Italy, and in the early part of the Age of Sail, the Ottomans and people like that. So while Spain can transit ships through the Strait of Gibraltar, there is obviously, especially in the Age of Sail, quite a bit of travel time involved from going from somewhere like Corunna round to Cadiz or similar. And as a result, Spain is forced to have a large fleet, but a fleet that is essentially split in two for the most part. And that also means they end up building, especially in the Age of Sail, fleets that actually have very different balances of ships. So, for example, on the Atlantic coast, galleys and even galleasses aren't hugely useful, except in limited portions of coastal defense. But in the Mediterranean, they're incredibly useful. And the flip side, galleons, while very powerful, are somewhat more of a disadvantage in the Mediterranean as compared to what they're in the Atlantic. So there's that. Spain also has another unfortunate problem with coastal geography, which is that it has a very large coastline and happens to be, for most of its existence in the last 1,000 years, right up close to the Barbary corsairs, who tended to raid and pillage the ever-loving you-know-what out of the poor Spanish coast, which in part accounts for why Spain struggled in the latter stages of the Age of Sail when it came to putting together a navy with experienced sailors across the board, simply because there was multi-generational trauma about living near the Spanish coast, because the people who did tended to get kidnapped and live horrible lives as slaves or worse in the various Barbary corsair states or get sold on to the Ottomans. And as a result, despite theoretically, given the very large amount of coastline that Spain has, it should have a very large seafaring population. It actually has, throughout pretty much all of that period, a dramatically lower percentage of its people as seafaring population as compared to other countries with similar amounts of coastline and or population ratios. Germany, of course, once it's unified, has the problem of Denmark sitting in the middle of it, and even if they controlled Denmark, the physical existence of the Danish peninsula makes it somewhat difficult to move ships from the North Sea into the Baltic. So again, the Germans are facing having to potentially have two separate fleets, and that's why they build the Kiel Canal, amongst other things. And then on top of that, the other really big problem that they have apart from limited numbers of ports, is that somewhere like Wilhelmshaven in the Jade estuary, there's the Jade Bar, which is out in the estuary. And once you get to World War I, for example, at low tide, you can't actually get some of the bigger ships, and certainly any big ships that have been damaged, over that. You actually have to wait for specific tides, obviously, which happen each day, to bring ships in and out when you're talking about your battle fleet. And that actually puts some significant operational constraints on what they can do. And it especially becomes annoying when you have ships like Seydlitz at Jutland or Moltke here, which has been torpedoed in 1918, and they bring them in, and, well, you're trying to bring them in as fast as possible, which is a relative value, obviously, given the amount of damage they've got. But you get there, and then you find, oh no, it's low tide. We physically can't cross the Jade Bar. We're going to have to sit here leaking, or in Seydlitz's case, partially grounding, while the tide comes back in, which, of course, would be a fantastic opportunity if there happened to be any British submarines in the area. And the US, perhaps more than anyone, has an east coast, and then later on a west coast, and potential enemies on the east and west coast, or potential enemies for whom the east or west coast is going to be their first port of call. And that's why you have the Atlantic and the Pacific fleet. And with things like the Spanish-American War, huge problems going, okay, well, the war's broken out on the side of the continent we weren't expecting. Quick, send lots of ships around all of South America to try and catch up. And shockingly enough, much like the Germans built the Kiel Canal to solve their problem, the Americans built the Panama Canal to solve that problem, which of course then becomes a massive strategic choke point, and then they have to invest in protecting that so that they can have much greater strategic flexibility in terms of where ships are on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And then more specifically, something I've commented on before, especially in relation to the sort of the little bit of a laugh we sometimes have about just how many American battleships manage to run aground in their own home waters. When you look especially at the American East Coast ports, and to a certain extent the West Coast ports as well, while America does have a decent number of reasonably nice ports and harbours once you actually get into them, the approaches to those ports and harbours are often very extensive, very shallow areas of water in which there may only be very narrow, limited and winding deep water channels, and so in some cases, especially once again you get to the 20th century with deep draft ships, there may not be any naturally occurring channels, and you end up having to make your own. And a good chunk of why so many ships end up going aground, especially big battleships, is that you're essentially threading a needle, and you get one thing even slightly wrong, whether that be a course estimation, time and putting your rudder over or whatever, and suddenly you're outside the channel and you discover that, yeah, you had 35 feet of water, now you have 18, and guess what? Your draft is a bit bigger than 18 feet. Chris Hodgson asks, with regards to Gibraltar, I worked for 6 months at Gibraltar, having had to drive my car down there from Devon. With regards to its World War II defensibility, there was a debate the Admiralty had decided to provide only a token defence against threats like Stukas and Fallschirmjäger while planning to immediately invade and occupy the Spanish coast on the other side, say somewhere like Tangier. Have you heard anything about this one, and do you have any details? That would be new to me, because when I visited Gibraltar, as you can see here, when I looked around, and obviously you can go and tour this yourself as well, there were quite extensive defensive preparations built into the rock and into the harbour of Gibraltar to resist potential German or Spanish attack, up to and including rather complicated and, you look at it and go, wow, you really thought this through. That's slightly worrying. Measures to leave behind resistance forces, both for intelligence gathering and for sabotage and working behind the lines. And this included things like entire compartments built into the rock which would be supplied with food, water, radio transmitters and everything, and in the event that the rock was falling, they would literally blow the tunnels connecting them to the rest of the tunnel network, so you physically couldn't get in and access them or even know they were there unless you did massive amounts of rock moving. And of course they would have other routes for observation and or sabotage. And there was quite a lot of, as I said, conventional defence and reserve built into the rock, including things like huge underground garages for supply vehicles and the occasional armoured vehicle. And the level of naval facilities in terms of things like dry docks and magazines and just the strategic position, I don't think that could be replicated in anything close to adequate levels by taking somewhere like Ceuta or Tangier. I have a feeling, based on what I've seen, that the Admiralty was very much in favour of keeping the rock as much as humanly possible. And the thing was covered in all sorts of artillery, including quite a lot of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. So they were fairly well equipped to deal with an air threat as well. As far as specifically Stukas and Fallschirmjäger, well, Stukas would be dealt with partly by the fighters that would be based at the airfield, which you can see is this in the modern airport, was what I'm taking the photo across, and partly by the various batteries of anti-aircraft guns. Fallschirmjäger, though, I can completely understand why you would not bother putting any defences against Fallschirmjäger in place other than, well, here's some rifles and here's some anti-aircraft guns, shoot the things on the parachutes. Because, quite frankly, you don't need to put any significant defences against Fallschirmjäger apart from some guns in, because as you can see, if you are a Fallschirmjäger and you get dropped on Gibraltar, you have really, really managed to tick off somebody in the hierarchy, because your options are land in the Mediterranean and drown, land on an extremely narrow strip to the west of the rock, and then face a several 100-foot near vertical climb and or just be picked off like a fish in a barrel, slam headlong into the western side of the rock, which is on the left-hand side, roughly speaking, in this photo, and just smear yourself liberally across the small portion of Gibraltar, land on top of the rock and break one or both legs and or your spine and or various other optional body parts as you tumble down the still very steep and rocky escarpment, possibly being mobbed by the monkeys on the way down. Or you could land in the actual city in the west, which everyone's going to see you coming, and there will be troops with sharp pointy bayonets and possibly civilians with sharp pointy things waiting for you. Or if you're really, 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 really lucky, you might fall into the harbour, at which point someone might come and fish you out if you're lucky. Classe Cornate asks, what happens if you have the 3 Sferias facing off against the 3 Deutschland-class Panzerschiff in a fight for Gotland? By attacking Gotland, you neutralise Sweden's coastal gun advantage. A German stomp on this scenario is creating a lot of fracas in my wargaming community. That's actually a really interesting fight. The Deutschlands do have a slight speed advantage. It's not much. It might make a little bit of a difference. However, the Deutschlands also have a slight firepower advantage. They have 6 main guns versus 4 on each of the Sferias. However, weirdly enough, the Sferias actually have a slightly heavier secondary battery. They both have a similar level of direct secondary battery, but once you get below the 5.9-6-inch battery, the Sferias actually have more guns. The Deutschlands do have more torpedo tubes, but both sides have them. But to be perfectly honest, if you've got into torpedo range in this particular engagement, something's either gone horribly right or horribly wrong, and it probably isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. The Sferias are slightly harder targets to hit, being a little bit smaller, a little bit lower, closer down to the waterline. So overall, you might be thinking, okay, well, the Deutschlands theoretically have a reasonable set of small but possibly important advantages in this scenario. And yes, up until this point, that would be true. However, there is one catastrophic difference between the two that actually means I personally think that if well fought, the Sferias might actually pull this off. And that's not just because the Sferias practiced coordinated firing together as a single unit considerably more than the Deutschlands did, although that would help them. It's simply the fact the Sferias have considerably better protection, as in they actually have protection against the Deutschland's guns. The Deutschland's 11-inch guns were quite ferocious against, cruisers, but they're not that much more improved compared to German World War I era guns, 11-inch guns specifically. The Scharnhorst guns are considerably better, but we're talking about the Deutschlands here. And that means that thanks to the Sverries having more than twice the armour protection of a Deutschland, or at least most of the Deutschlands, considering that each Deutschland has its own bespoke armour scheme, it means that to reliably penetrate all portions of a Sverige class, including the turret armour and the belt armour, the Deutschlands would have to get to 15,000 yards at the outer limit, or probably less, maybe 12,500, 13,000 if the Sverries put themselves at a slight angle, maybe as low as 10,000. As far as the Sverries are concerned, it's open season on the Deutschlands, because when the Deutschland's armour starts to become effective against their 11-inch guns, you're basically at the outer limits of where you'd be comfortable engaging on with either side's ships anyway. And I think that actually hands it to the Sverries, because obviously, if you get hits that knock out fire control systems and set fires and so forth, that's bad. You could mission kill them. But the simple objective fact remains that if you stop both sides out at 30,000 yards and they try and close in on each other, well, yes, the Deutschlands can gradually close in on them, even if the Sverries try to pull away. But the Deutschlands are going to have to cross at least approximately 10,000 yards of distance, which admittedly is only between about, it's just over 5.5 miles, but it's 5.5 miles that if the Sverries decide they don't want you to close that distance and sail somewhat away from you, it's going to take you about an hour to cross, and in that time, the Sverries can punch shells into your magazines, into your turrets, into your engines, into basically anything they want, and you have to rely on essentially soft killing them in return. And so I think, barring some miracle, the Sverries would actually take it. Lord Druken asks, while it's understandable why iron-hulled warships didn't quite take off in the world's navies, were there any commercial use ships other than Great Eastern that used iron hull construction? Yeah, quite a few, actually. Great Eastern's immediate predecessor in Brunel's grand shipbuilding schemes, the SS Great Britain, the world's first screw-powered iron-hulled ocean liner, and can still be seen in Bristol to this day, was, as the name suggests, or as I just described, an iron-hulled vessel. And iron-hulled merchant vessels were reasonably common. I mean, they weren't the most common in the 1850s and 1860s. There was still a huge number of wooden vessels out there, but iron-strengthened wooden construction was extremely common, and anyone who could afford the additional cost of building an iron merchant ship in the first place would go through with building one, because it allowed you to build a bigger vessel, a vessel that was actually, all things considered, somewhat lighter, and obviously iron structurally, because it's stronger. The iron hull plating and the beams and the frames and everything are physically smaller than the big oak framing timbers that you get on wooden ships. Therefore, you have more internal volume. Therefore, as a merchant ship, you can carry an awful lot more, and the hull is stronger, so you're more likely to survive. The iron hull's also a lot more suited to putting in bulkheads, which again increases survivability, and it's also much more suited for auxiliary steam engines, because it doesn't flex quite as much. And so while building an iron merchant ship, whether that be a screw-powered one, a paddle-powered one, or the occasional pure sail one, was more expensive because, of course, the technology is more advanced. It requires more a smaller pool of skill, so that there's fewer people who can actually do it. And if you are going to build out of iron, you generally will want to build big, which is also going to cost a fair bit. So iron merchant ships don't take over immediately, but there are quite a few of them out there, especially amongst the bigger merchant ships of the mid-19th century. Because the big problem that plagued iron-hulled warships, as opposed to iron-armoured warships, which was, well, they don't respond very well to getting shot at in cold waters, well, merchant ships didn't really care about that too much. Physical Removal Enthusiast asks, in Das Boot, the sailors receive a bottle of beer after sinking a ship. Did that really happen, and did other navies do something similar? Yes, it did happen in some cases. The reason I say that is because it was an unofficial policy. So In some U-boats, you sank a ship. Great, fantastic, good job, guys. On to the next one. In some other U-boats, it'll be, hey, well, we sank a ship. Right, everybody gets a bottle of beer. In other U-boats, it would be everybody gets a shot of schnapps or brandy or whatever, because, as I said, it was pretty much entirely down to the discretion of the captain and what he chose to bring aboard. And similarly in the US, although it was officially a dry navy, they did have medicinal spirits on board. So if a submarine sank an enemy ship, again, down to the captain's discretion, there may be some form of alcohol-based reward in it for everybody. And some captains wouldn't do it, some captains would do it, some captains would restrict it for particularly notable kills, like a really big tanker or a warship. Entirely, again, down to captain's discretion. Obviously, you have navies like the Royal Navy that still have alcohol rations in World War I and World War II. And although, again, an alcoholic reward for sinking an enemy ship is not a matter of official policy, it is, of course, far more common because, well, having alcohol aboard is just par for the course at that point. So, for example, going through my series on Johnny Walker, whenever one of the ships in his squadron manages to sink a U-boat, he orders them to splice the main brace, which means everybody gets an extra tot of rum, which I can only imagine could lead to some very interesting antics on some of their missions, when they sink 3 or 4 submarines in the course of a day. The Past is Another Country asks, for me, one of the most confounding decisions in naval history was Britain's insistence on the 14-inch caliber restrictions with the Second London Naval Treaty. I get trying to limit new ships, but the cat was already out of the bag. There were already plenty of ships with greater than 14-inch guns, and at the time it was also pretty clear that several nations weren't going to follow this rule anyway. Was this just another item in a long list of Britain's self-sabotage in the interwar period, or did they have a legitimate reason for this request that I'm missing? So, I mean, this whole discussion is probably, again, a Wednesday video in and of itself, but the short version is that there's a multiplicity, I should say, of factors with regards to the British pushing for the 14-inch gun. Some of it is coming out of political considerations to do with the First World War. Once the war was over and things had settled down, a significant degree of war weariness had set in to significant portions of the British population and definitely the British political establishment, and they just didn't want to fight a war. Again, certainly a big one, and if they had to, then they wanted it to be significantly less casualty heavy than the First World War. So in actual fact, in the early 1930s and in the run-up into Second London, the British were actually at one point pushing for a limit of 12-inch guns and either 25 or 28,000 ton displacement for capital ships. And now, as I say, that's partly driven by the political establishment, who's trying to essentially legislate war down to a much less lethal level. Partly it's also down to, surprise, surprise, the Treasury, who see this and go, yes, well, clearly a ship that's 7 to 10,000 tons lighter and with smaller guns is going to be cheaper, so we definitely want to push that. And there are some, I wouldn't say many, but there are some in the Admiralty who are also kind of pushing in that direction, especially because capital ships are limited by overall tonnage, and one of their major concerns, much as with cruisers, is to have as many hulls as humanly possible. So, knowing also the Treasury doesn't want to give them a huge amount of money, their sort of internal logic seems to be that, well, if we can create a world where battleships are only 25,000 tons, then the older, bigger, meaner battleships will age out fairly quickly, and then on our given total tonnage limits, we can have a lot more battleships, so we can have lots of battleships in lots of different places. And while all the people who are supporting this are very happy with themselves, then in comes people like Admiral Backhouse and various other Royal Navy officers who take one look at this and go, this isn't going to work. Because while 14, 15, 16-inch armed ships are gradually aging out, they are still around. So if you're going to build a ship armed with 12-inch guns, you're going to need to protect it against considerably larger guns, at which point you end up with a floating brick with minimal armament. And then obviously the older ships, which are designed theoretically to be proof against 14, 15 or 16-inch gunfire, are going to be essentially immune to your new ships. So the whole thing is very silly. And Backhouse suggests that 14 inches is probably the minimum caliber they can go down to because, well, even if you eliminate 15 and 16-inch guns from the mix, huge numbers of ships across the world's fleets have either 14-inch guns or close to, like the 13.4-inch guns on the Britannias. And, persuading people to drop 2 or 3 ships, in the case of, the 16-inch gun vessels, okay, that might be doable. Persuading people to give up almost the entirety of their fleets, that's not really going to work. But then you also have 2 much more significant considerations that are a lot more tactical and a lot more relevant to the Navy when it comes to fighting a war. One of which is they look at various design studies and they go, okay, well, if we want to have a fast battleship now, so 27, 28 knots, and it's got to be protected against, at least 15 or 16-inch gunfire, and we've now got to incorporate either a dual-purpose secondary battery or split anti-surface, anti-air batteries, and the anti-air component, whether it's dual-purpose or single-purpose, has to be quite large now. It's just not possible to build a balanced battleship design on 35,000 tons that incorporates all of that and has 15 or 16-inch guns. They think they can maybe just about edge it with 9 15-inch guns in some of the earlier design studies. But even then, they think that's marginal. And so they're just like, well, you know what? We can build a fairly balanced design with 14-inch guns on 35,000 tons. So maybe that's what we should push for, because otherwise, if we keep with existing limits, some people are going to build unbalanced designs so that they can have 16-inch guns, and then we're going to have to armor against those long term, and then that's going to throw out our design balance as well, especially because everyone will want similar caliber guns. Now, of course, there are certain special tricks that you can do to pull off a roughly 35,000-ton ship with bigger than 14-inch guns, like all forward designs, aka Richelieu, or accepting significant inefficiency in your power plant and building a short little dumpy thing like the 1930s South Dakota class. But in terms of a balanced design that isn't making significant sacrifices elsewhere, the British are broadly correct in this assessment. The other thing is that while almost everybody else is going long-distance gunfire is, the key, the British are going, yeah, long-distance gunfire is great and we will train for that. However, they notice that even with, 1930s era fire control, the number of hits you get at 25, 30,000 yards or even 20,000 yards is not that great. But when you get to 15, 16,000 yards, suddenly the number of hits you can score with modern fire control goes up quite dramatically. And so the British just go, okay, fine. We're going to fight at the range where we're going to get lots and lots of hits. And that leads to, well, several things. Firstly, at that kind of range, a 14-inch gun has more than enough firepower to punch through pretty much any armor scheme in existence. So why go any bigger when that's adequate? Secondly, if the gun is adequately powerful, as we just said, then with a 14-inch gun you can have more of them, which means more dice rolls, which means more chances to hit, and that's a good thing. And thirdly, they appreciate that, okay, yeah, if we're closing down to 15, 16,000 yards or even closer, well, not only are we going to be running in under fire, and we will be firing back, but also when we get there, the enemy guns are also going to be very effective against armor, so that pushes our design more towards needing to favor armor more than anything else, which, again, saving some weight with 14-inch guns makes a fair deal of sense. So there's lots of different reasons why they're pushing for the 14-inch gun. Some are more political and socio-economic, and some are more practical. And yes, they do begin to realise as the Second London Treaty negotiations start going on that perhaps other nations aren't going to strictly follow it. But one, that's why they put the escalator clause in, because they hope to persuade everybody to. And secondly, they do take a bit of a view that 8 15-inch guns versus, at the time, what they're planning for King George V's 12 14-inch guns, there's probably not a huge amount of difference in that, especially at closer ranges, so they're not too worried about that. Obviously, then the Japanese go off and everyone thinks they're building 45,000-ton ships with 16-inch guns, and then everyone starts getting a bit jittery and building escalator clause designs. We've found the problem and it isn't ours asks, what do you know about how the Victual Brothers were organised? Well, I've seen the term used to basically mean any northern German pirate, privateer or maritime mercenary from around 1400. To my understanding, there was a real organisation of that name who, for a time, had headquarters in Visby. How were they structured? How did they choose their leaders? And how did they come to decisions? So, yes, the Victual Brothers and their successors were a real organisation, and yes, at one point they were headquartered in and around Gotland. They started out as a loose, I guess you could call it a privateering guild. Essentially, some of the Hanseatic League members turned around and said, well, you know, we really, really like some naval support in this war we're having, so any private sailors who want to come and help out, well, here's kind of a loose umbrella organisation, and we'll pay you to do stuff for us. And that's their essential start point. But they very rapidly, after that initial stint as mostly blockade runners, ended up turning to piracy, which for a while, again, the Hanseatic League wasn't too fussed about because they were mostly being pirates against the people that the Hanseatic League didn't like. But in terms of organisation, it was a very loose organisation. So you had obviously various ships' captains, and much like many other pirate organisations through the Age of Sail, they relied on equal division of loot, or near enough equal division of loot. Some people will go on about how, pirates were an early form of democracy in the Western world, and I mean, yes, technically, in that you vote for things and everyone gets a say and so forth, but realistically, this is not bound in the same kind of civic uptake that you'd see in later Western civilization. It's more bound in the fact that once you've turned to piracy, you have abandoned pretty much all laws of God and men, at which point trying to enforce any kind of hierarchy that relies on, well, tradition says this, or the law says this, or the church says this, is going to fall down on the fact that everyone's going to turn around and say, yeah, but we don't care about what those people and organisations say anyway, so why should we obey a leadership structure that relies on their say-so, which leaves you with a kind of very vicious meritocracy, which very quickly leads into, okay, how about instead of stabbing and killing each other, we all agree that everybody gets a say. And that's the kind of the core principle behind which most pirates operated, essentially just a case of mutual shared interest in survival and not having miniature civil wars all the time. On a larger scale, while there were dozens and dozens of ships in the overall Victual Brothers organisation, it was kind of repeating that same organisational level, but just at a higher grade. So there weren't admirals of the organisation. There were various captains who all had various ships, and if you had a particularly charismatic or knowledgeable captain, or one who had good contacts and therefore could say, oh, hey, Hank, there's this really good opportunity over there, I think we should go and exploit it, it was essentially down to them to gather support from other captains. And this did make the command structure relatively flexible and adaptable, because if you then showed up and, the guy that everyone had agreed to follow for this particular assignment knew the coastline of that area really well, and he knew the town that they were going to try and plunder really well, but then you get there and you discover, a Danish war fleet, and that captain doesn't have a huge amount of direct combat experience, but perhaps one of the other captains has a fair bit of experience fighting, particularly the Danish fleet, and the odds seem relatively in their favour, or maybe at least equal, then everyone would very quickly go, okay, well, maybe we should now be taking orders from the guy who knows what he's doing when it comes to this element of naval combat, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, factionalism and people trying to consolidate power and so on and so forth did happen, as is wont to do in these kind of unregulated organisations, but that was the principle, at least, by which they were supposed to operate. Michael Imbezi asks, what is the origin of the stepped-down stern seen on many warships such as USS Arizona, and can you point me to any good documentation on it? For documentation, I'd say drop me a message, because exactly which documentation I would point you to would depend on what level of detail you want. Because if you want very basic details, there's any number of decent secondary sources I could point you to. If you want perhaps more in-depth naval architecture details and calculations for exactly where you should put the step down, etc., then obviously that's an entirely different set of sources, primarily shipbuilding guides and so forth, which I can probably scan some pages from. But for a more general answer, in battleships like Arizona, you can see here the step down is immediately aft of the mainmast on the right here there. It's originally a function of the increased size and speed of dreadnought-type battleships. So if you look at the immediately preceding pre-dreadnoughts, like the King Edward VII, the Lord Nelsons, the Connecticuts, etc., you tend to see that they have a fairly continuous deck running all the way along the ship. That is a continuous upper deck. But you have two big issues when you get to dreadnoughts. Firstly, they're faster. Now, if they're faster, that means they kick up a higher bow wave, and potentially in similar sea conditions, because of their speed, they're going to plunge a lot more. Also, obviously, because of their greater size, just lengthwise, etc. But also with greater size comes greater displacement, and therefore greater cost. Now, if you keep the upper deck at the same level as you would with a pre-dreadnought, you just get water coming over the bow all the time, so that's not good, so you need to elevate the forecastle. But if you're going to elevate the forecastle, you need to do it over most of the initial length where you'll have a bow wave occurring, and you want it to also be a useful structural element. So if you look at something like, say, HMS Dreadnought or various other early dreadnoughts, most of them, they will tend to have a raised forecastle, and it will drop down to a continuous deck level somewhere around the forward guns. Because, of course, this additional height isn't strictly necessary for the watertightness of the ship. It does add weight higher up, which affects stability, but you need to keep the ship dry, and therefore you try and minimize that distance as much as possible, and then drop down to a more regular freeboard. There is a compromise involved, of course, because if you have a continuous upper deck surface, that means your entire hull forms a rather nice box girder shape if you're looking at it from fore to aft. Whereas if you have a step down, that is a concentration of stress which could cause issues. And I mean, this applies to cruisers and destroyers as well to a certain extent, but we're talking about battleships at this point. But then as time goes on, you get other issues that come up, like the fact that the casement secondary batteries are perhaps a little bit too low in the water, so you want to raise them. But if you're going to raise the casement batteries, do you put them in a very light gallery on the upper deck and make manoeuvring around the upper deck very difficult? Or do you just extend that raised forecastle further back and essentially put in the extra deck further along your ship, at which point, hey, you've now created additional accommodation space and a level which you can move your casement battery to while remaining within the hull, and therefore you can build in the various protections as opposed to open gun galleries with open deck guns. Also, as ships get larger, obviously, the amount of freeboard that they can have before affecting stability, because they've got beamier and so forth, does also tend to rise. So you can see with Arizona here, her secondary battery is running at that upper deck level. However, the weight issue is still there. The minute you don't need that upper deck level, you ideally want to get rid of it and accept the compromise that comes with it, because obviously if you just continue it further aft, you're going to have to elevate the aft guns, the main guns, one deck higher. That's going to add in a whole bunch of additional weight and cost. It's going to mean you need a slightly larger hull to accommodate all the additional displacement, and the whole thing becomes bigger and more expensive, and you can't build as many of them. So you cut it down, and then now the main armament, as you can see with the aft end of Arizona, the main armament has dropped down. The stern, which obviously has to cut up quite severely to accommodate the propellers, doesn't have to support as much weight, so that helps with your trim and your balance and the strength you need to build into the stern. And exactly where this cutoff occurs, and you get the step down, varies quite considerably on different ships and in different nations, And with some ships, they later, in the 1930s and so forth, will abandon it altogether and go back to being flush deck. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School Training Vessel Harakaze asks, I always knew about Americans in the RAF before the US joined the war, and had some idea that a handful had served in the Army, but I was rather surprised to read recently that not only had 22 Americans served in the Navy, they were officers. Could you briefly talk about that, please? Yeah, so as with the Americans who served in the RAF and so forth, these were Americans with varying degrees of existing naval experience, ranging from having had a career in the US Navy to having graduated but not been commissioned due to medical reasons and so forth. But they all, in various ways, found out about Nazi German ideology and decided that it would be better if that was set on fire and preferably, blown up and scattered to the four winds. But with America looking like it was going to stay out of the European conflict, through various means, they ended up in the UK volunteering their services. Some directly to the Royal Navy, some to the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. It varies depending on the person. And the Royal Navy looked at them and went, well, we could always use some good officers. They've got the training, so they would go through an accelerated training course at Greenwich and receive commissions at various grades as Royal Navy officers. Now, the reason they don't get talked about all that much is that technically what they were doing was illegal according to US law, and it was much easier to hide them in the Royal Navy when, even on the absolute smallest vessels, they're still going to be one of a dozen plus people if you're on a MGB or an MTB, or one of, a couple of hundred if you're on anything substantially larger than that. And so to essentially protect them from potential blowback, especially early on, the Royal Navy, as I said, kept the whole thing very, very quiet, as opposed to the RAF, where obviously it's a little bit more direct. There is only one man in a Spitfire, one man in a Hurricane, and so forth. And so the pilots, the US pilots in the RAF, tended to get a little bit more attention. Once the US got involved in World War II, it is actually quite interesting because some of those 22 officers chose to then go back to the US Navy, either directly or via transfer, because, hey, well, now the US Navy was involved, that's kind of what they'd wanted in the first place. Whereas others decided, well, hey, we're all fighting the same people, why cause any further disruption, and stayed with the Royal Navy throughout the conflict. In some cases, taking on kind of a double duty or an additional duty as a liaison with the US Navy, because, hey, well, who better to liaise with the US Navy than someone who's actually been in said Navy? But others just kept on going with a fairly regular Royal Navy wartime career. Obviously, some of them would be killed in action, but many others would survive. And interestingly, one of those who was briefly in the Royal Navy, transferring back to the US Navy once the US Navy entered the war, would actually go on to found the Navy Combat Underwater Demolition Teams, who would be the forerunners of the Navy SEALs. Lord Nelson asks, during the classic age of sail, ships of the line could famously take huge amounts of hits from cannon fire and yet stay afloat. This brings me to the question, how was the necessary hull thickness and rugged construction of ships of the line determined? Was there a similar level of proof against their own guns, or how did that work? It was actually a very iterative process, because remember, we're talking about the ship of the line emerging from the great ship in the 1600s, and then obviously going forward in time. So this was not a period of scientific ship design as we would understand it today. Most of the work that was done, it was scientific to a degree, but it was iterating on pre-existing stuff, modifying and tinkering here and there with what they thought worked. Rules of thumb, there were some textbooks that people put together, but it wasn't really particularly organised. So individual shipwrights would have very different ideas about how to build ships of the line, although obviously physics does force people down roughly similar pathways, but still with a fair degree of variation. And at that point, when you're taking into account how you build a ship of the line, weirdly enough, Gunfire is not one of the things that's their primary consideration. The first thing they've got to consider is these are very large ships for the capabilities of wooden construction up until the beginning of the 19th century. And so they need to build them quite heavy and quite strong, simply so that the ship will hold together. Then they've got to account for the ship spending time at sea. You don't want it to work itself loose, just about able to hold itself together, but it's going to work its seams really heavily in rough weather, so you've got to build in additional strength. You've then got to consider the guns, yes, but not in terms of what's being shot at you. The guns as in what kind of guns are you actually trying to support on the ship, because if you've got to support, let's say in the later stages of the Age of Sail, 32-pounders on a lower gun deck, or 36-livre guns if you are the French, well, that's a lot of weight. You've got to build the sides of the ship capable of supporting the knees. You've got to build the decks, obviously mounted on the knees, all capable of dealing with that weight, and that means strength, and that means closely packed framing, etc. And the heavy planking provides both a good seal against incoming water, longitudinal strength, again, against the ship working, and also by double or even sometimes triple layering it, it provides a certain degree of durability in terms of things like wear and tear and rot and so forth. Because if you have a, let's say, single layer of planking, then if that planking gets damaged or destroyed, or it starts to rot, you have a problem, because now you have a hole in the side of your ship that you need to patch up. Whereas if you have, say, a double layer of planking, not only can you, align it such that it actually helps strengthen the vessel, but if the outer layer, which is subject to the weather and etc. at the most, gets damaged or rotted, etc., you can pull that away and replace it without compromising the inner layer of planking, and thus you can actually do kind of in the field repairs, if you like, although obviously you're at sea, so there is no field. And when it comes to maintaining the ship, again, you can have it sitting in ordinary, i.e. in reserve, for a good period of time. And as and when it's time to bring it back into service, if you need to strip off some outer planks and replace them with new ones, that's a lot easier than stripping off a single layer of planking and opening up the hull to the outside elements. So a huge amount of what's decided is based largely around just strength and endurance of the ship. And then people start to notice, oh, hey, well, we've got these really heavy-set, heavy-built ships, and small arms fire, canister shot, grape shot, and even lighter cannonballs at distance don't tend to go through. Well, this is a useful degree of protection. And that's when you start to see things being modified and tweaked a little bit. It's not as regimented as you would see later on in the Age of Steel, where people are looking at, oh, well, we want to resist a shell at this range, or we want to resist a shell traveling at this speed. It was more a case of, well, if we put 18 inches of timber on this thing, then we get small arms and scattershot resistance. But if we put 22 inches, then a 700 yards, a 12-pounder doesn't get through. Okay, I guess we'll go with that then. Silder and Machine Works asks, how did ships during World War II avoid firing on friendly aircraft? I can understand that during normal flight operations, carrier could simply tell other ships, expect my planes to come from this direction, but during an attack, wouldn't it be difficult to distinguish between enemy attackers and your own combat air patrol? Certainly heavy anti-aircraft guns could engage targets well beyond the range of positive identification. Did the combat air patrol just stick to certain designated sectors, or was there some other method of avoiding friendly fire? It's actually quite an involved topic, and maybe something I should do a Wednesday video about at some point, but broadly speaking, for long-distance issues, early on in the war, it relied on radio coordination, and then later you'd have radar coordination, and you also had the introduction of IFF systems. So at that point, you could have the operations room, if you're the Royal Navy, CIC, if you're the US Navy, looking at things and going, right, well, this formation of aircraft is ours, either because they've radioed in and we've verified that with telescopes, or they've got an IFF, or we've tracked them since they were launched. In any case, we know that these are our combat air patrol, and this lot aren't. And then you pass down the instructions to the guns and say, right, you engage this lot on bearing 270 as opposed to that lot on bearing 320, because that lot are friendly. And you hope you've got it right and you hope everybody listens. Obviously, no system is perfect. Another thing for long-distance combat air patrol, interception, and long-distance anti-aircraft fire was that there would actually be designated zones. So if you saw a stream of bombers coming in at, let's say, 60 miles out, you'd vector your combat air patrol, they'd attack them, and then as that bomber column was entering the bracket of the long-distance anti-aircraft fire, you could then radio your combat air patrol and say, all right, lads, break off. We're now spitting 4.55, 5.25 inch shells in that general direction. They do not care what roundel you have on, so get clear. But when you're talking about light and medium anti-aircraft guns, so your 20mm, 37mm, 40mm, etc. cannon, then it got a little bit different. Sometimes it would be a case of, well, the combat air patrol will do the long distance interception, and if aircraft get this close, then assume they're hostile, shoot them down, and that obviously gives your anti-aircraft gunners the freest run. But it does mean that fighters that might be in pursuit of attackers would have to break off, and that actually reduces the number of potential shoot downs that you want. So at other times, you would have your own fighters swarming in along with the attacking bombers. And that's when it came down to essentially visual recognition. Because even with an IFF system, if you've got, half a dozen Vals or Stukas coming in on you and a couple of Fulmars or Wildcats gunning for them, there's no meaningful way to tell a bunch of 40mm and 20mm gunners, especially early on in the era where they're either operating completely under local control or near enough, hey, well, that guy's friendly and this guy isn't. So this is why, for example, in the pre-war and very early US involvement in the Pacific War period, you have the US roundels, which are red, white, and blue, the US Navy roundels, that is, and that includes a little red dot in the middle. Very quickly, they realize, well, the Japanese have a big red dot on them, so they eliminate the red dot completely, and so you just get the white star with blue outlining on US Navy aircraft, specifically so that at a distance, someone's just not squinting into the sun and going, hey, I see a red dot on the side of that aircraft, blow it out of the sky. Because at that kind of distance, you're not necessarily going to be able to perceive, is that a little red dot that's a foot across, or is it a big one that is 4 or 5 feet across? You just see a red dot on the side of an aircraft and, well, you open fire. And also you have to rely to a certain degree on visual recognition by your gunners. Again, no system is perfect. There were friendly aircraft that were shot down by accident by their own fleet's anti-aircraft gunners, and obviously that was a tragedy, but not one that they could meaningfully do anything about at that stage, other than just try and intensify training. And so, for example, when you look at the Pacific conflict, it was a very, very big issue that you had to drill very heavily and repeatedly into US anti-aircraft gunners, because, well, the Japanese attackers were radial engine monoplanes and the American defenders were radial engine monoplanes. Luckily, most of the time, the paint schemes at least were different enough, but if you were looking at a very fast-moving object that might just appear as a dark blur, you're going to see radial engine monoplane and, well, probably better safe than sorry. Hence, as I said, a lot of training and a lot of emphasis on things. And then you look over at the Royal Navy and the British Pacific Fleet, and they have a little bit of an advantage because while they are operating Hellcats and Corsairs, which are, of course, radial engine monoplanes, they're also operating Seafires, which are piston engine monoplanes with a very different wing form and nose shape to the average Japanese attacker. And that's one of the reasons why, amongst others, you very often see Spitfires doing the close-in fleet defense work, because it's much, much easier to mistake a Hellcat or a Corsair for a Japanese aircraft as compared to mistaking a Spitfire, or a Seafire in this case, for a Japanese aircraft. Not that it always helped, but, and obviously at times if there's a Corsair squadron and it's the only one that can make the interception, they're going to make the interception and just hope people recognize gull wings. But you're making the best of what you can given the technology of the period. Reichspeer Minister asks, what are good ways to cluster automation systems on warships from Carthage to Korea, taking into account things like automating propulsion, lighting, weapons, and so on, with the goal of getting an idea what to research further to be able to determine the or a degree of implemented automation. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I would probably cluster things in the following way, possibly maybe using a grid system. So you would want to break up the various systems into functions. So propulsion would be a good one. Weapons would be another good one. Lighting, I don't think I have lighting specifically, but maybe crew comfort. So you'd have things like lighting and ventilation and all those kind of things under a single heading. And then on the other axis, the thing I would do is probably trying to work out to what degree things have been taken out of human hands. Now, obviously, this is mostly what you're trying to determine, but I would come up with broad categories. So first category is the thing that I'm looking at, is the function that I'm considering something that a human could naturally do in some way, shape, or form. So, for example, using this picture, flight or having aircraft aboard, I would not say is something that would actually count as automation in and of itself, having, like in this case, a float-plane swordfish, because flying is not something humans naturally do. You don't have people flapping around with their arms going, hey, I can see stuff really far away. But hoisting the aircraft into and out of the water, now, technically speaking, this is something you could do with king posts and block and pulley and manual hauling, much the same as you can do with the ship's boats. But in this case, as you can see, they're using a powered crane. So that is a degree of automation, because you've taken a thing that a human could do, or a human could primarily do, be the primary source of motive power, for instance, and you've moved that over to some form of mechanical assistance, which has made the job easier, because you'd need quite a few men if you were going to try and manually operate a king post crane and hoist a swordfish in and out of the water. But to operate this mechanical crane, you probably only need a single operator, and obviously it'll need maintenance as well, but that's par for the course. And then I would further break it down into what kind of mechanical assistance am I getting? Is it a case of the mechanical assistance is enabling me to do something that would perhaps otherwise take a lot of men? So, for example, rotating a turret. Yeah, you could have a bunch of people on cranks, but having electro-hydraulic systems or whatever, you've removed the need for that many men. Or are you doing something where you still have basically the same number of men, but you're now doing a process faster? So ammunition hoists, for example, you still need quite a lot of men in the magazines moving the shells and the charges to the hoists, but whereas before you, like in the Age of Sail, you would then have people physically carrying the charges and the shells or the shot up to the guns, now you're using a mechanical system that's moving those rounds and charges much more quickly up to the guns. So you haven't really reduced the number of men you're using that much, but you are making the process a lot faster. You could also look at systems that are removing men from the day-to-day operation completely. So instead of having somebody have to come in and light and fuel lamps, etc., if you want light on board a ship, electric lighting would be technically a form of complete automation, because once that light is on, unless the bulb blows or something, it just is there. It doesn't need fueling. It doesn't need anything, any exterior interference to continue doing its job. You could also look at, is this automation allowing me to do the same general function, but in a way that exceeds realistic human capacity? So going back to the shell example, someone carrying a 32-pounder cannon shot up from the ship's hold is a plausible thing that they could do. Having a hoist that does it makes it easier, but you still theoretically have a human backup. Whereas a 2,000+ pound heavy armor piercing shell, there is no way a human or even a group of humans is actually going to get that thing up from the magazines to the gun turrets on their own. by muscle power. So at that point, that's a slightly different form of automation than just enhancing what you can already do, but your human could do it as a backup. And yes, I know there are chainfalls where you could hoist it up slowly, but even then, the chainfall is a form of automation because it is a mechanical assistance. In that case, reducing the number of people, as well as making the whole thing a bit more convenient. Cheddar Bacon asks, do you ever care to go to air shows to see the naval aircraft you hear so much about in flight? And if so, what are some things that stuck out to you on hearing and seeing those aircraft in person? I know when I go to EAA in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which I highly recommend, and they have half a dozen carrier aircraft all taxiing, I can't help but imagine the cacophony of a World War II flight deck with a few dozen aircraft all prepping for launch at once. Yes, I've actually enjoyed going to quite a few different air shows. Obviously, the biggest one in the UK is the Royal International Air Tattoo, sadly cancelled this year on account of being full of B-52s and B-1s. But nonetheless, I observe all the aircraft, but obviously there's a few naval aircraft there as well. I did go to some of the last of the Yeovilton Air Days. They haven't come back post-COVID, which is a bit of a shame because obviously those were much more focused on naval aircraft than general aircraft as a whole. The only real limitation, I would say, of going to the air shows to try and appreciate what they would have been like at the time is, of course, the historic aircraft have to be treated with kid gloves to a degree because they're quite old and there's certain safety restrictions. Unless they're privately owned. Privately owned aircraft tend to be a little bit more proactive. Like, for example, the Navy wings at Spitfire. It flies considerably more aggressively than the Battle of Britain memorial flight Spitfires do. And then, of course, you have the more modern aircraft like this F-35, and they obviously perform a lot more actively because they are current frontline aircraft. They can be thrown around the sky considerably more, and it is all very entertaining. So, yes, I do enjoy watching the aircraft at air shows, but at the same time, obviously, even when you have several aircraft all preparing to take off, at the same time, you are still somewhat back at the safe distance in the crowd line, hopefully. So compared to being on a flight deck on a carrier where those things are going to be, a dozen feet away from you, I suspect is a rather different experience. Lawson Tse asks, I was bemused to learn that the Spanish Armada occurred just a few years before the Imjin War. How would the Japanese or Korean fleets at the time have fared against the Spanish Armada? Generally speaking, assuming that there was a degree of wind, very poorly, because the Spanish ships as a whole would be larger. They would obviously be armed with extensive cannon batteries, even if they're somewhat slower firing than the English fleet that opposed them. They have a lot of heavily armed and, to a degree, armoured troops on board, and, crucially, their upper decks are considerably higher than the average upper decks of most of the Korean and Japanese ships in question. So if you're taking the big Spanish and Portuguese, etc., galleons up against either the Korean or Japanese fleets, they're going to dominate quite heavily, especially when you take into account you've also got things like swivel guns and so forth to provide further covering fire. However, there is a big caveat to that, and that would be, what if the wind dies or is very light? Because the Armada, with the exception of some of the galleasses, relies entirely on the wind to actually move. If the wind is calm or very light or non-existent, then the Armada is essentially immobilized, at which point both the Korean and Japanese forces, although they can move under the wind, they also move under human power as well. And at that point, using, to a certain extent, sheer numbers, but also just concentration tactics, either of the Korean or Japanese fleets would then be able to focus down sections of the Armada, much as how the galleasses at various points tried to pick off individual English ships, and swarm it piece by piece. But in a straight-up engagement where both sides are capable of moving, the Armada should dominate. Matt Kidd asks, you visited a lot of museum ships of similar types. Can you name a few museums that stand out among their peers and have particularly interesting or unique features or exhibits? Now, this is going to sound somewhat subjective because, well, it is, but I would say that quite a number of the smaller ships have stood out in my memory. So you can see here USS Leyte, for instance, and you'll see Hyder in a minute as well. Now, that's not necessarily because their crews take especially greater care than any other ship museum crew. I mean, there are plenty of large museum ships where the crews are, equally as dedicated. However, when you're looking after something like a destroyer, a frigate, a corvette, or something of that scale, I think you have the opportunity with a reasonable size, relatively dedicated crew to restore, refurbish, and maintain a really large proportion of the overall ship. As you can see, all the people there on Slater. And, the engine rooms, the machinery rooms, relatively small. You can, in theory, do all of that, the main armament, etc. And so I think when it comes to that kind of thing, assuming that you have a reasonable budget, you can then make a lot more of an impression with a visitor, because you get the idea that you can see pretty much all of the ship, barring a few exceptions here and there. Whereas if you have something the size of an aircraft carrier or a battleship, there's a certain degree of redundancy. Do you want to go through the expense of opening up turret 1, turret 2, and turret 3 if you're Iowa, North Carolina, or South Dakota, or obviously poor old Texas? They've got 5 main battery turrets to worry about. Do you want to go through the fuss of restoring and opening and guiding people through 3 identical or near identical spaces, or do you just go with the one or modified variations thereof? Same thing when you've got 10 5-inch 38 mounts. How many of those do you make available to people? You're going to have vast amounts of accommodation spaces. Do people really want to spend 2 hours traipsing through near identical bunking spaces? The same thing with the machinery spaces. If you've got 4 big machinery spaces, each with an identical machinery setup, you probably want to focus your efforts on one and you close the others off. Now, each of those areas will be very impressive, but again, subjectively, you can get the impression that you're only seeing a portion of the ship because, well, you are seeing a portion of the ship. The fact that it would cost stupid amounts of money and possibly even dilute the experience just to have you being able to go into all 4 machinery spaces or all 3 turrets, etc., objectively, it makes sense why they would do this, but as I said, subjectively, you can get the impression that you're confined in a larger environment. But obviously, the flip side to that is that the larger ships do have all this additional space in which they can put in additional displays, additional museum sections, which smaller ships very often aren't going to have the space to do. And I think you kind of have this weird dichotomy where if your ship is unique, then its very existence is kind of a major selling point. So, for example, with Texas, yes, there are a number of battleships in the US, but she is the only surviving dreadnought battleship as opposed to fast battleship. That in and of itself gives her a certain cachet that will make people want to come and see her regardless of anything else. And of course, she has a fairly extensive combat history that she can put in there as well. Conversely, if you are a vessel that there are multiple surviving examples of, such as, say, a Fletcher class, well, now, you have to make yourself a bit more distinct, and there you can see a fair degree of variation. So, for example, the Kid can play on the fact that it is about the closest to original World War II condition as you're going to get out of the various Fletchers, whereas the Sullivans can play on the legacy of the Sullivan brothers and have sections dedicated to them. And if you've got a ship that has quite an extensive combat career, like Hyder here, well, that's an obvious draw that you can bring people in to see and hear and experience. And again, using contrast, you sometimes see people do things in a relatively unique way compared to the norm. So, for example, the Mariners Museum in Newport in the US, they've got the replica of USS Monitor, they've got bits of the actual USS Monitor, they've got various other bits of machinery and various bits of ships. However, those are integrated into a much larger museum. And I think actually that works very well, because none of the individual ships, or in the case of the Monitor replicas, are probably in and of themselves enough to draw in visitors, because being relatively small, you can only be there for a certain amount of time. So sure, people would show up to see it, but they'd be there and gone in half an hour, which for a museum that relies on people buying things as well as just the admission ticket, that's not really going to work very well. But by integrating it into a much larger museum that gives a lot of context to the ships and bits of ships they have on display, that works really well, I think. And then going the other way in terms of contrast, if you listen to almost all US museum curators, they'll tell you that multiple ship museums struggle or just flat out don't work. And I think in the US this can be true, partly because of the sheer size of some US museum ships, like the carriers and the battleships. That is basically a full day. If you have another ship alongside, someone's either going to have to do a very truncated tour of both, or they're going to have to come back for 2 days, which a lot of families probably won't do, or they're going to visit one or the other, at which point, well, you might as well just have them all visit one and halve your maintenance costs. But in other countries where either the ships themselves are not as big, and or the country is just smaller, which is going to be most countries compared to the US, then you can have museums that have multiple vessels that actually do very well, and not necessarily even in spite of, but because they have multiple vessels. So, for example, the Den Helder Museum in the Netherlands, that has loads of ships as well as museum structures that you can go and visit, including some various fairly famous ones like Abraham Kreutzchen, or the National Museum of the Royal Navy down in Portsmouth, because they've got M33, they've got Mary Rose, they've got Victory, they've got Warrior, they've got Alliance, and all the other various museum elements around them. And that works as a concentration of vessels. Now, sure, you can't experience the Portsmouth Museum all in one day, but there's enough different stuff to keep you coming back. And so that brings us to the end of near enough 7 hours of Drydock. I think this is a record breaker for the longest Patreon Drydock so far. So thanks very much for listening, everyone. And, well, if you survived this far, and see you again in another video.